Let me see. Shows up.
Okay. Have you started, Pedro?
We should be live, but it has a little bit of delay, from Streamer to YouTube. I have YouTube open in a different screen. People are already saying good afternoon and all that.
Okay,
oh, we are live. Oh, sorry. Okay. I'll just focus on myself for the beginning.
Okay.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Estamos aqui começando o nosso segundo dia do evento sobre o romance americano dos anos 1920. Eu vou fazer uma explicaçãozinha rápida em português só das coisas mais burocráticas. Basicamente, sobre os certificados, eu vou enviar no chat. Vai aparecer na minha conta pessoal do Gmail, vai aparecer lá, Pedro Oswaldo Horta Martins Pena. Eu vou enviar as informações, vocês precisam preencher aquele formulário e aí depois enviar os dados para o e-mail do Lero, né, do Laboratório de Estudos do Romance. Todas essas informações vão estar no chat, eu vou mandar elas periodicamente. E aí, mas o mínimo de presença necessário para que vocês possam receber o certificado é 2/3. Então, se você não participou de pelo menos uma das mesas de ontem, seja a apresentação do professor Marcos, seja a mesa lusófona das professoras, infelizmente a gente não vai conseguir fornecer esse certificado. Dito isso, passo a palavra para a professora Sandra, que vai apresentar nossos 3 palestrantes de hoje, e a partir de agora também tudo será em inglês. Infelizmente não temos como prover uma tradução. Sandra, floor is yours.
Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's a pleasure to receive and welcome 3 outstanding specialists in the American novel. And I'm going to introduce them to you all together, one after the other. And then I'll pass on the floor to Professor Shaheen, who's going to be the first to present to make his presentation. Well, I'd like to start then the introductions by saying a few things about Professor Shaheen. Aaron Shaheen is the George C. Conner Professor of American Literature at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. His teaching and research interests include disability and gender studies, Southern literature, and the First World War, the Great War. His most recent books are Great War Prophecies in American Literature and Culture, Oxford University Press 2020, and he's also the co-editor of John dos Passos' Transatlantic Chronicling, Critical Essays on the Interwar Years, which is forthcoming from the University of Tennessee Press this year, right? 2021.
They've actually pushed it off to the next year.
Okay, so that's going to be
2022.
Yeah. All right. In 2011, he co-founded the John dos Passos Society, which has held its most recent biennial conferences in Lisbon, Portugal, and Madrid, Spain. I'm now going to introduce Professor Taylor Hagood to you, who teaches American literature, specializing in the writing of William Faulkner, African American literature, and the literature and culture of the United States, of the South of the United States. Professor Hagood's books include Faulkner's Imperialism, Space, Place, and the Materiality of Myth, 2008, Faulkner, Writer of Disability, 2014, which was the winner of the C. Hugh Holman Award for Best Book in Southern Literary Studies. And he also published Following Faulkner, the critical response to Yakanapatopa's architect. This is very, very complicated to pronounce for us. You have to teach us how to say that. I have been, struggling with this word for ages, which was 2017, which is his most recent book. Along these monographs, he also edited Critical Insights, The Sound and the Fury, 2014, and co-edited Undead South, The Gothic and Beyond in Southern Literature and Culture, with Eric Gary Anderson and Daniel Cross Turner. Currently, he's the president of the William Faulkner Society, and he writes the annual review of Faulkner scholarship published by Duke University Press's American Literary Scholarship Resource. Professor Kirk Curnutt is professor of English at Troy University near Zelda Fitzgerald's hometown of Montgomery, Alabama. He is the executive director of the Scott Fitzgerald Society and the managing editor of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. He's the author of the Cambridge Introduction to Scott Fitzgerald and has recently co-edited a collection of essays celebrating the upcoming centennial of The Beautiful and Damned. And he's now completing another collection of both Fitzgeralds, so the couple's relationship with the South. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Thanks very, very much on behalf of the university and our faculty for accepting our invitation. So I will pass the floor to Professor Shaheen, and I'll just silence mute my microphone here. It's all yours, Professor Shaheen. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And thanks to the University of Sao Paulo, Dr. Vasconcelos, Dr. Horta, thank you for your coordination of this event. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be invited. I have some slides that'll go along with the presentation, and I think Dr. Horta has been nice enough to, there we go. I see the first one coming up right now. If you see any typos, if you see any
Professor
typos,
Shaheen,
don't tell me.
Add two points that I forgot to make.
Sure.
The first one, I am sadly not a doctor, far from it. I'm still an undergraduate student.
Oh.
And just to make everything. Well, I am, thankfully. And the other thing I forgot to mention in the beginning, if anyone wants to make questions, feel free to make them in the chat. I will be watching it the whole time, and I will be collecting the best ones to ask the professors by the end of the presentation. Is that all right?
I think we should make clear that questions should be left for the end.
Yes.
That's okay? No, I just make sure that everybody's aware that questions will be actually dealt with at the end of the three presentations. Okay, back to you, Professor Shaheen.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt.
Just a quick check. Can you hear me okay? Am I close enough to my speaker that you can hear me okay?
Nice and clear.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thanks again. Political and social life in 1920s America sought what President Warren G. Harding famously called a return to normalcy, in which the recent World War and Wilsonian ambitions of democratic expansion abroad would give way to a noticeable withdrawal from the world stage in a booming economy fueled by consumer spending. Yet the conflict from which the United States and its allies emerged victorious maintained a greater resonance than any political slogan or marketing campaign from the Roaring '20s would care to admit. The violence the world first confronted in 1914 was in many ways anticipated at least 5 years earlier by a group of Italian avant-gardists known as the Futurists, led by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who set forth an artistic and cultural program based on mechanized speed and chaotic violence. In June 1914, only a little more than a month before the war's outbreak, in fact, the English Vorticists, led by Wyndham Lewis, followed up on the Futurists' fascination with mechanized speed and violence but with the added imperative that both must be controlled and precise so as not to break down into chaos. In keeping with the very notion of a vortex, vorticists held that there should be a fixed and stable center from which speed and destruction emanate. As Hal Foster explains the difference, quote, in images and forms, futurist art favors the explosive, while vorticist art is fixed. Thus, futurism strives for an ecstatic release of the body ego, even to the point of violent disintegration and death. Yet vorticism struggles to keep the body and the ego intact and hard. The war's sophisticated and precise weaponry seem to bear out the competing visions of violence that Foster finds in the futurists and vorticists. For never before in the history of technology had warfare been more precise, controlled, and efficient, and yet never had such mechanical sophistication on several worldwide fronts unleashed so much bloody chaos and unpredictability. In the United States, a new stock of writers, many of whom saw the war up close, took it upon themselves to show that the horror of between 9 and 10 million dead soldiers had not been forgotten as the 1920s got underway. Among those at the forefront of such recognition was John Dos Passos, who, as an ambulance driver on the French and Italian fronts, saw what technology could do to the human body. Though the writer never adopted a futurist or vorticist political program, both of which have clear ties to fascism, his novel's consistent emphasis on high-speed dynamism, technology, and violence clearly suggest that he was influenced by these avant-garde movements. Dos Passos himself credits his novelistic innovation of simultaneity to the futurists, and several critics have shown just how deeply this debt runs. But what is less acknowledged is the author's familiarity with and absorption of English vorticism, which he apparently first learned about while an undergraduate at Harvard. I argue that Dos Passos was putting futurism and vorticism in conversation with each other. This dialogue is evident in his 3 best-known novels from the 1920s, One Man's Initiation, published in 1920, 3 Soldiers in 1921, and Manhattan Transfer in 1925. Vorticism's emphases on controlled movement, balance, and protective boundaries between people, objects, and ideas are not only what separates it from futurism's bent toward high-velocity dispersal and explosiveness, but also what many of Dos Passos's characters adopt as a means of emotional and physical survival in a modern world where the dividing line between war and peace, safety and danger, has grown increasingly blurry. But as I will also explain, the vorticist preoccupation with controlled violence frequently gives way to futurist chaos and dispersal, just as Dos Passos's characters themselves, often in the very attempt to maintain equilibrium at high speeds, spin self-destructively out of control. Dos Passos's most cited recognition of the artistic influences of the early 20th century comes from the foreword to his 1931 translation of Blaise Cendrars's poetry volume, Panama. And here's what you see on the screen before you. Quote, under various tags, futurism, cubism, vorticism, modernism, most of the best works of art in our time has been the direct product of an explosion. Cendrars and Apollinaire poets were on the first Cubist barricades with the group that included Picasso, Modigliani, Marinetti, Chagall, that profoundly influenced Mayakovsky, Meyerhold, Eisenstein, whose ideas carom through Joyce, Gertrude Stein, and T.S. Eliot, first published in Wyndham Lewis's Blast. Those parentheses, by the way, are his parentheses, not my own, that you see on the screen. The word explosion is certainly apt to describe the artistic scene in the years leading up to the First World War. When Marinetti proclaimed futurism's arrival on the pages of Le Figaro in 1909, it offered the example of an overturned car in a ditch as a pledge of living life on the edge of death. Consider, for example, the 3rd and 4th declarations of the manifesto. Number 3, literature has up to now magnified pensive immobility, ecstasy, and slumber. We want to exalt movement of aggression, feverish sleepishness, the double march, the perilous leap, the slap, and the blow with the fist. We declare, this is number 4 now, we declare that the splendor of the world has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing automobile with its bonnet adorned with great tubes like serpents with explosive breath, a roaring motor car which seems to run on machine gun fire, is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace, that being the famous statue now housed at the Louvre. In its founding manifesto, as well as its manifesto titled War, the World's Only Hygiene, futurism promoted not just life on the edge of death, but also life's spectacular and inevitable capitulation to professional, if not actual, death. Quote, when we are 40, the founding manifesto later explains, let younger and stronger men than we throw us in the waste paper basket like useless manuscripts. They will come against us from afar, leaping on the light cadence of their first poems, clutching the air with their predatory fingers and sniffing at the gates of the academies the good scent of our decaying spirits. There's a clear sense of nihilism here, for the doctrinaire futurists must therefore live in order to die rather violently at the hands of a new generation. Historical continuity is given over to a savage, bloodthirsty frenzy. Vorticism draws on many of these same mechanized, violent, and militaristic themes. For instance, in both the first and second issue of Blast, only 2 issues were ever published. The first one you can see here on the screen, that's 1914. Those whom the vorticists despise are blasted, quote unquote, in big, bold typeface, as if the magazine itself becomes an instrument of violence to wipe such putative adversaries into oblivion. But the distinction between the 2 movements that is most relevant for my presentation is found in the second issue of Blast, 1915, in an article in which Lewis explains vorticism's artistic aims in comparison to those of Cubism and Futurism. Quote, the Cubists' paintings are static and representative, not swarming, exploding, or burgeoning with life, as is the ideal of the Futurists, or electric with a more mastered, vivid vitality, which is the conception of their mission held by most of the vorticists. And you may, that mastered there in italics is my italics, but it's so central to the difference he's trying to draw, especially with Futurism. For Lewis, Futurist painting admirably depicts dynamism and burgeoning life, but it does so without either the clear, hard lines or the sense of visual focus so favorably rendered in Cubism. Vorticism, therefore, is superior to these rival movements by depicting depicting objects in controlled movement, controlled. These objects' hard lines typically converge at one visual center, thus creating a vortex in which a, quote, more mastered, vivid vitality can prevail over what Futurism seems most to exalt, a swarming and an exploding chaos that gestures toward not just annihilation, but self-annihilation. To get at the heart of these distinctions between Futurism and Vorticism, we can look at the 1911 painting by the futurist Carlos Carrà, titled The Funeral of the Anarchist Gali, and the cover issue of the 1915 issue of Blast, the cover of the 1915 issue of Blast. Carrà's painting certainly shows vivid colors and a sense of relentless movement, but the eye struggles to find a safe focal point. And thus a funeral to mark a solemn occasion becomes a swarming frenzy in keeping with the anarchism that the dead Angelo Gali, killed in a labor demonstration in 1904, strove for in his own life. In their desire to merge life with art, Futurist canvases, according to one of its main practitioners, Umberto Boccioni, sought, quote, to put the spectator in the center of the picture. Yet making the spectator the seeing center only increases the sense of chaos, as anyone who is caused and therefore become the center of an automobile accident can surely attest. On the other hand, Wyndham Lewis's cover illustration for the second issue of Blast depicts a number of men with angular, hardened faces holding what looks like guns or similar instruments of injury. None of the swirling, blurry lines found in Carrà's painting can be found here, though there is still a sense of urgency and movement about the scene, as if the men are rushing to attack something outside of the frame. In the background are a number of objects that could be the wreckage of a battlefield or tall, menacing buildings. Like Carrà's painting, the cover suggests that even a civilian cityscape can become a war zone. But the way that the guns, the leaning posture of the men, and the lines of the buildings or war wreckage all converge at one center of the picture suggests that the initiators of the violence are in control of the movement. Their centrality to and instigation of the chaos protects them from being caught up in it. John Dos Passos's fiction teases out these crucial differences between futurism and vorticism. Hanging in the balance is the role that violence plays not only in his novels of the 1920s and beyond, but in the post-war world. His first novel, One Man's Initiation, 1917, which he began writing while driving an ambulance in the Verdun sector of the Western Front, meditates at length on how to contain the inevitability of violence in the modern world. Few critics have given any sustained treatment to Martin Howe's actual role as a volunteer ambulance driver and his relationship with the ambulance itself. But without it, he would have no reason to be in France at all. And their destinies, if not their identities, are indelibly linked. In the logic of mechanized warfare, the ambulance he drives should ultimately adhere to the vorticist premise that humans that humans use automobiles and other machines to control or to shield themselves from violence, and not, as the futurists would hold, as semi-sentient entities with which to merge. It is, after all, the chief means by which injured men, the ambulance that is, after being subject to the chaos of warfare, are transported to hospitals where medical technologies can, under the best of circumstances, restore their bodies to wholeness and health. And yet these instruments used to contain violence's reach among humans are constantly at risk of being taken for humans. As Martin learns early on from a fellow driver, one of the Germans' planes chased an ambulance 10 miles along a straight road the other day, trying to get at it with a machine gun. The man who was driving got away, but he had shell shock afterwards. The firm distinction the vorticists would like to maintain between human and machine, with the former in control of the latter, breaks down as the ambulance itself is treated by the German pilot not as a machine, but as a soldier to be targeted for obliteration. On a moral level, the line separating right and wrong becomes indecipherable, as a plane attacks a defenseless vehicle whose purpose is to take wounded and therefore non-threatening soldiers away from the front lines to a field hospital. The result of these breakdowns in distinction is a shell-shocked man. That is, someone whose psyche has been so invaded by the threat of mechanical warfare that his human capabilities are compromised. In another instance, not related to ambulances, but relying on the same faulty premise of outer protection, Martin observes a barrage from the relative safety of a dugout. Quote, "Now and then, like some ungainly bird, a high-caliber shell trundled through the air overhead. After its noise had completely died away would come the thud of the explosion. It gave him somehow a cozy feeling of safety, as if he were under some sort of bridge over which freight cars were shunted madly to and fro." The images of safety Martin conjures are mechanical and orderly, a bridge over which a train runs on a regulated schedule. The solace Martin takes in these structures is not all that different from the praise for, quote, machinery, trains, and steamships, as well as factories, new and vaster buildings, bridges, and works that, according to the pages of the first issue of Blast, proved the ascendancy of the Anglo-Saxon genius. Not surprisingly, however, the safety is short-lived. After emerging from his dugout, quote, Martin had looked for an anxious minute or two at the tangle of trenches and pitted gangrene soil in the direction of the German outposts. And all along these random gashes in the mucky clay were men, feet and legs huge from clotting after clotting of clay, men with grayish-green faces scarred by lines of strain and fear and boredom, as the hillside was scarred out of all semblance by the trenches and the shell holes. In only the space of one page, vorticist order breaks down into futurist chaos. The protection Martin feels imagining himself under a bridge gives way to a lack of distinction, as gray melds with green and rotted humans mix and become nearly indistinguishable from torn up landscapes. Notably, the scene is so scattered that Martin cannot find a central vantage point from which to absorb the destruction, and as a result, neither can the reader. Coming out in 1921, just a year after one man's initiation's rather underwhelming debut, Three Soldiers proved to be Dos Passos' breakout novel. Its notoriety stemmed in part from its realistic depiction of military life and its resistance to worn-out tropes of wartime valor. Told in a more conventional style, it tracks the progress of three young Americans, John Andrews, Dan Fuseli, and Chris Crisfield, from enlistment through wartime and finally to the summer of 1919 as a peace is being negotiated at Versailles. While several critics have uncovered the novel's futurist underpinnings, Vorticism has been lamentably missing from the critical discussion. John Andrews' decision to enter the military and embrace its mechanization, for instance, is reminiscent of the Vorticists' appreciation of military and their desire to seal off one's personality. Lest this hysterical wall built around the ego, the first issue of Blast proclaims in its celebration of emotional aloofness. Similarly, at the outset of the novel, Andrews seeks an escape from personality. Quote, "This is what he had sought when he had enlisted," he said to himself. "It was in this," meaning the army, "that he would take refuge from the horror of the world that had fallen upon him. He was sick of revolt, of thought, of carrying his individuality like a banner above the turmoil. This was much better, to let everything go, to stamp out his maddening desire for music, to humble himself into the mud of common slavery." Andrews' deep disappointment in his inability to give his love of music expression through composition, in other words, has impelled him to close off his personality in order to protect the rawness of his emotional wound. But perhaps Andrews was initially correct to suppress his emotions in the army if, as futurism holds, emotion is best expressed through a love of mechanically induced violence, even to the point of self-annihilation. Andrews reaches this revelation when he, Fuseli, and Crisfield and their fellow enlistees watch a movie saturated in anti-German propaganda while still in basic training. This particular scene is crucial not simply because it is the first time when the simultaneity of the storylines converge into the spatial vortex of the movie house, but also because of the conflicting impulses of power and submission that the spectacle instills in them. And you can see this on the screen. Quote, "Andrews felt blind hatred stirring like something that had a life of its own in the young men about him. He was lost in it, carried away in it, as in a stampede of wild cattle. The terror of it was like ferocious hands clutching his throat. He glanced at the faces around him. They were all intent and flushed, glinting with sweat in the heat of the room. The scene bears the signature of a futurist frenzy, namely a mechanically induced communal furor that carries, quote, a life of its own." In her reading of this scene, critic Lisa Nanny suggests that the cinema, quote, is one more form of modern technology that the systems of government will use to obliterate individual will and power. And yet the film's emotional appeal to the soldiers gives them the impression that they are supremely, even irrationally, empowered. One recruit is brought to such a point of orgiastic anger that he exclaims, "I never raped a woman in my life, but by God, I'm going to. I'd give a lot to rape one of those goddamn German women." This nihilistic ecstasy is found most prominently in the novel in Chris Crisfield, the Indiana farm boy whose resentment of his superior, Sergeant Anderson, is so intense that in one of the most chilling episodes of the novel, he takes advantage of a skirmish with the Germans to lob a grenade and blow Anderson to smithereens. What begins as an inter-army battle between the Germans and the Americans becomes an intra-army chaos, wherein one man allows his personal grudge to break down the chain of command and dissolve all moral boundaries. As Crisfield pulls the grenade pin and walks away from the explosion, quote, "A warm joy went through him." His contentment in chaos provides the appropriate release to assume a mechanical bearing. As soon as he regains his unit and falls into formation, quote, "his feet beat the ground in time with the other feet. He would not have to think whether to go to the right or to the left. He would do as the others did." In a move that blends the more chilling aspects of futurism and vorticism, the intra-army chaos comes to an orderly resolution. The actual death of Anderson precipitates not the preservation of Crisfield's vulnerable soul, but rather its obliteration, the soul's obliteration, and the ascendancy of his automation. The contention between futurism and vorticism takes on a new setting as Dos Passos turned his focus from the war-torn landscapes of Europe to the American metropolis in Manhattan Transfer. Beginning in the year of the incorporation of New York City in 1898, the novel tracks the lives of many people up through the years of the First World War and into the Prohibition era, sometime close to the novel's publication date in 1925. It is this novel, more than any other published during the 1920s, that Dos Passos himself attributed to futurism. Quote, "The Italian futurists were trying to produce something that stood up off the page. Simultaneity, some of them called it. That excited me. Why not write a simultaneous chronicle, a novel full of snapshots of life that is like a documentary film?" The concept of simultaneity amid a chaotic historical backdrop, The concept of simultaneity amid a chaotic historical backdrop compels readers and characters alike to search for a centering or stabilizing component in the text. I argue that this impulse, however fleeting and successful, is vorticist in nature in its elusive search for a vortex by which the internal and external movements of people can maintain a central and centralizing force. Quote, "The vorticist is at his maximum point of energy when stillest. The vorticist is not the slave of commotion, but its master," the first issue of Blast proclaims. And in keeping with the vorticist program, the way to achieve and sustain physical distance and psychological integrity in an urban environment that often resembles a war zone is to be at the proverbial eye of the hurricane so as to be able to regulate perpetual movement at a relatively high velocity. Bud Corpenning, like Crisfield, is a farm boy with a violent history. He arrives in New York at the beginning of the new century, hoping that he can outrun his past, the murder of his father, by sinking into the anonymity and constant circulation of urban life. Upon arriving in Manhattan, he tells the man next to him on the ferry, "I want to get to the center of things." This remark, or at least some variation of it, comes up a number of times. For Bud, the center initially means Broadway, which can operate as the center around which the vortex of the metropolis circulates. As a street known for theatrical spectacles that quickly come and go, Broadway's larger meaning ultimately proves elusive. Bud learns this lesson soon enough, and he continues on his quest to find some other center, failing to realize that what he is really looking for is a personal centering that will help him to deal with the memories and guilt of murdering his father. His inability to find stable work and his growing fear that a detective is following him turn him into a street wanderer, embodying in human form the futurist conceptualization of erratic movement headed towards self-destruction, which finally occurs when he throws himself from Brooklyn Bridge. Ellen, Thatcher, Oglethorpe, Hirth, Baldwin offers the novel's most sophisticated synthesis of futurism and vorticism. Circles and centrality are her calling card as much as they are Bud's. Her very birth, in fact, is heralded by seagulls wheeling above the hospital. But if Bud's suicide is based in part on his inability to find a center, Ellen learns early on that the only way to maintain a sense of stability is not to protect an emotional center through a hardened exterior, as vorticists would hold. Rather, she obliterates her center, even its very notion, and becomes a mechanical shell through and through. As her many surnames suggest, Ellen is a centralizing force in that she becomes a reference point in a novel that follows simultaneously the disparate lives of many characters. Moreover, her name, not to mention her childhood fear of being kidnapped, is evocative of her centrality. Like Helen of Troy, she finds herself at the center of many men whose desire for her leads to violence and ruin. As a young woman, Ellen learns that the most efficient way to advance her Broadway career is to marry the renowned actor John Oglethorpe. Immediately after marrying him, and likely sensing that he is a closeted homosexual, Ellen experiences a lasting transformation. In the train's honeymoon car en route to Atlantic City, and perhaps as a result of either disappointing sex or a lack of sex to consummate the marriage, she looks across the bed at her sleeping husband and realizes her mistake. Quote, "She pushed her forehead against the window frame. Oh, I want to die. I want to die. All the tight coldness of her body was clenching in her stomach. Oh, I'm going to be sick." She went into the bathroom and closed the door. When she had vomited, she felt better. Then she climbed into bed again, careful not to touch John. If she touched him, she would die. This scene depicts Ellen at the most vulnerable moment in her life, and the vulnerability localizes itself literally at her very center, her stomach, which in centripetal fashion seems to draw all her anxiety and bodily tension to a central point. As she retches, her stomach, her center, becomes empty, and with that centrifugal vomit go her human vulnerabilities. As a result, she is able to sleep comfortably in the knowledge that the old Ellen has indeed died. When she wakes to the sound of the train car's rattling window frames, quote, John was far away and at the other side of the big bed. With the wind and the rain streaming in the window, it was as if the room and the big bed and everything were moving, running forward like an airship over the sea. As she observes her sleeping husband, quote, she lay giggling on the far edge of the bed, giggling desperately as she used to with schoolgirls. Having emptied herself of her center, Ellen can look on at her marriage to a homosexual with a kind of bemused nihilism. Everything around her is in movement, the train car, the rattling windows, the rain outside, and yet she remains at the center of this vortex, calm and controlled. But at what cost? This newly centered Ellen does indeed advance her career, and in doing so, her inner hardness seemingly moves to the exterior. Her mechanistic dynamism is governed by the logic of a dangerous vortex. When dancing with Jimmy Herf for the first time, she instructs him with precision in a voice that sounds like a sharp metal saw. Quote, get up on your toes and walk in time to the music. Move in straight lines, that's the whole trick. Meanwhile, quote, fat men and thin women and fat men rotated densely about them. The danger increases as her copper-colored hair and the saw-like voice assume a more dangerous and alluring bearing. Quote, she was an intricate machine of sawtooth steel, white bright, blue bright, copper bright in his arms. When they stopped, her breast and the side of her body and her thigh came close against him. He was suddenly full of blood, streaming with sweat like a runaway horse. Significantly, a circular metal saw is at its most effective when it rotates from a stable center. But whatever lies within its path is bound to be dismembered. Jimmy's similarity to a runaway horse is a suggestion of Ellen's ability to disperse people out of her orbit and into erratic and destructive trajectories. If vorticism relies in large part on assuming a mechanical bearing as protection from outside threats, individuals are still subject to breaking down, and aging. Upon meeting George Baldwin at a posh hotel for what will prove to be a marriage proposal, a twice-divorced Ellen explains that she is dead tonight, just dead, and excuses herself to the restroom where she regards herself in a mirror. Quote, she kept winding up a hypothetical doll self and setting it in various positions. Tiny gestures ensued, acted out on various model stages. In a novel that has characterized Ellen through circular motion, readers are left with an instance in which she, quote, winds up her internal mechanisms to possess the emotional hardness to endure a proposal by and marriage to a man she does not love. All the while, she knows that soon, quote, her figure will go, the menopause haunting beauty parlors, packed in Bonsilla facial cream, having your faces raised. Even the vorticist attack on nature, and presumably on time, is futile, a point made all but too clearly by the futurists in their imperative that one generation must throw off the next. Dos Passos' novels of the 1920s provide a crucial index for how the fiction of the decade unfolded. The cars of Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby and William Faulkner's Sartoris, for instance, become veritable characters that overpower great war veterans who use them. In gaining this kind of standing, the cars also prompt readers to consider further the ever-evolving relationship between humans and violent technologies. There were considerable differences between the futurists and vorticists, but whatever their differences, they have both proven precursors to fascism, another movement from the 1920s that has its roots in the Great War of the previous decade. Modern-day readers can therefore look to One Man's Initiation, Three Soldiers, and Manhattan Transfer to understand the attitudes and anxieties not just of the 1920s, but also of the next 2 decades, in which questions of how and why to unleash and control violence reach all new levels of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shaheen. And now, Professor Hagood, you may start presenting. And you said you would do the presentation yourself, very self-reliant man. So if you would be so kind as to insert the presentation into our little
I will do that in
space
just a
here.
second. I do want to just
No
take
problem.
a minute before I do that to thank you. Pedro, this is, you've done a wonderful job. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and this is all so well done. I just want to echo Professor Shaheen's comments and also about Professor Vasconcelos. I hope I'm saying that somewhere close to correctly, pronouncing that name somewhere close to correctly. It's a real honor to be associated with all of you. I love the presentation that we just had, and I especially appreciate bringing in that wrecked car at the end of Sartoris, or Flags in the Dust, as it's typically published under that title these days. And I appreciate that. It's a very interesting connection. So I appreciate that very much. And I want to say that I'm going to be moving in a little bit different direction, but there are certain reciprocities, I guess, between these presentations, and I'm sure the one to follow. My direction I want to go is a little more in a biographical one, and there's a lot of biographical work on Faulkner right now. So there's a new biography by Carl Rollison. There's work by Michael Gora and Philip Gordon, and actually Professor Curnutt not long ago published biographical work on Faulkner. So I'm kind of going that direction a little bit more. And with that, I will indeed share my screen here with you. And I'm going to go ahead and get that set up here. Hopefully, there it is. Okay. And I'll go ahead and start it, get it keyed up for you. Now, you should be able to see me somewhere on the screen also, I believe, Pedro.
Yes, we're all good to go.
Very good.
I will remove myself right now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it. The title of the presentation I'm giving is Faulkner's Beautiful Epoch. And I want to say before anything else, I'll go ahead and open the curtain. I'm able to hear applause here. I don't know if this is true or not, but I appreciate it. I do want to say that this lecture is dedicated to the late M. Thomas Inge, who passed away about a week or so ago. He was a great Faulkner scholar and a very generous and wonderful person, so far as I ever knew him, and did a lot of work in comic studies, and I would like to dedicate this talk to him today. Well, I want to begin the talk at last with a question. And that question that I have in mind and I would like for us to think about is, what if William Faulkner had died on January the 1st, 1930? If he had died that day, the writer we would be discussing would be a 1920s product. His body of work would consist of 4 published novels and another novel that was unpublished, a crime novel, and then an unfinished typescript that presumably, or at least maybe, would have been published after he died, maybe. That output, I believe, is pretty close to F. Scott Fitzgerald's entire output. And I would like to think about that Faulkner's 1920s resume would not have included necessarily the generation-defining stories necessarily that filled Fitzgerald's, but nevertheless, he could have boasted a sizable number of prose pieces and quite a lot of poetry. Faulkner's having penned the modernist masterpiece, The Sound and the Fury, published on October the 7th, 1929, would surely have ensured his place as a writer to be remembered. And by December, he had finished what he called his tour de force, and that is the one on the side of your screen as I lay dying. And about that, he said, "I'm going to write a book by which, at a pinch, I can stand or fall if I never touch ink again." Now, these two novelistic achievements, appearing amid the stock market crash and the early days of the Great Depression, might well cast Faulkner in our minds as a prophetic figure who portrayed a poorer, darker side of the United States, very different from maybe the scene that Fitzgerald was presenting. Now, for the most part, scholars have viewed 1920s Faulkner as an apprentice figure, making the transition from romantic to modernist via a transition also from writing poetry to writing fiction. That genre transition coincides with this transition from romantic to modernist. The young writer's interests in fauns and nymphs, as well as Greek and Arthurian myth and others, have often been viewed as deriving from T.S. Eliot's Golden Bough-inspired belief in the universality and reappearing and refashioning of mythology. What critics have not so often spelled out are explicitly the ways in which Faulkner channeled and negotiated artistic, musical, and literary elements of France's Belle Epoque. While the poetry of Mallarmé and the compositions of Debussy and the paintings and drawings of Toulouse-Lautrec might naturally be clumped in with other romantic influences, including the writing of Oscar Wilde and the illustrations of Aubrey Beardsley, more focus on the specificities of La Belle Epoque opens up Faulkner's artistic vision in key ways. It may come as a surprise to hear Faulkner's writing referred to in the context of late 19th and early 20th century France, because he is so often thought of as a chronicler of a single fictional Mississippi county. Now, that county, by the way, is pronounced Yoknapatawpha. Professor Vasconcelos was asking about that. I don't know, a lot of people are thrown by that word, Yoknapatawpha. You can practice this day and night if you would like. But anyway, this is how many people see Faulkner, unless you have worked quite a bit with his career and thinking about his output. But long before Faulkner turned to creating that county by heeding Sherwood Anderson's advice to write about his own little postage stamp of native soil, Faulkner was looking beyond his home state. Now, doing so made sense in light of Mississippi's having been and continuing to be well derided as illiterate, poor, obese, backward. Many times Mississippi rings in pretty low on the list in comparison to other states in many ways, culturally, in many other ways. It can often be difficult to find the poetry alongside all these other factors in one's home. And yet, on the other hand, the state was often romanticized as part of the larger fin de siècle national and even international celebrating of an idealized, nostalgic Old South, reconciliation romance of the period. Faulkner grew up among glamorous legends of his own great-grandfather, after whom he was named, whose statue rose above the grave he was sent to a bullet by from his business partner. The first William Clark Faulkner, pictured here, had been a colonel in the Confederate Army, a railroad builder, a visionary, and to some extent, a scoundrel. The great-grandfather wrote a lengthy romance set in the South entitled The White Rose of Memphis. But he also wrote the Mark Twain-esque rapid ramblings in Europe, which he gave an American's viewpoint about Europe. Now, Faulkner's mother, Maud, directed her son's artistic sensibilities also across the Atlantic. She was an artist who painted portraits of family members, including African Americans she considered family, however problematically. Maud made sure to have her children reading serious literature as opposed to the comics and westerns her husband read. The young William Faulkner was already by age 10 reading Balzac and Shakespeare, and his sweetheart, Estelle, is known to have read Voltaire at about the same age. Estelle came from a very old and established Southern family, arguably more prestigious than the Faulkners, and William, or Billy, as he was then called, setting his sights on her itself, represented a grasping beyond maybe his own station. The nature of his reading, as well as his writing and art, for his mother pushed him to develop his drawing skills, all put him closer to Estelle's sphere. And these were children of the United States' Gilded Age, which paralleled and in certain ways intersected with France's Belle Epoque. Major American artists and writers, from Henry James to John Singer Sargent to Edith Wharton, rooted their work in sophistication that navigated Europe's culture. La Belle Epoque, a period roughly paralleling the Gilded Age. James McNeill Whistler even laid claim to a kind of southernness. Oscar Wilde made Faulkner's reading list, and the boy became deeply familiar with Aubrey Beardsley's use of line and design in his illustrations for Salome, as well as Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. In Wilde's Salome especially, Faulkner found an entwining of language, rhythm, and visual effect. Interestingly, the Wildean style, sartorially, conversationally, and sexually, found a representative close to home for Faulkner in the form of Stark Young. Scion of an old planter family, Young taught at the University of Mississippi when Faulkner was a young boy before moving on to a career in letters in New York City that included a lengthy tenure as a drama critic for the New Republic. He also wrote many plays, wrote novels, translations of Chekhov. Now, Young maintained his Mississippi connections and would become an influence and model for Faulkner as an urbane, gay devotee of life and of beauty and art. The city in which Wilde died, Paris, particularly captured Faulkner's imagination. He loved the French language, and he became a serious and lifelong Francophile. The Paris contemporary with Faulkner was a city of La Belle Epoque. It is not always easy to trace out. Faulkner is aware of music, and it is difficult to pin down ekphrastic translations solidly enough to speak of one's writing as sounding like the work of a composer. But for what it is worth, something I can't prove, but believe and feel deeply and somewhat outside of academic discourse, I find that listening to the bold key and time changes of Maurice Ravel's string quartet in F major of 1903 brings me close to the sound of Faulkner's youth. A more solid connection to Faulkner comes in the cluster of poetry, music, and ballet. It's based in the image, imago, and libido of the faun figure, as embodied by Stefan Mallarmé, Claude Debussy, and Václav Nijinsky. The significant phrase and title is L'après-midi d'une femme, the title of the dreamlike 1876 poem by Mallarmé that inspired Debussy to compose the dreamlike prelude, L'après-midi d'une femme, in 1894, in which in turn became the piece Nijinsky choreographed his ballet to, also entitled L'après-midi d'une femme in 1912 for Ballet Russe. In 1990, William Faulkner published his first piece in a major national magazine, and it was a poem entitled L'après-midi d'une femme. Now, it appeared in the New Republic. Stark Young had not yet become the drama critic for the magazine, but Faulkner's having a Mallarmé, Debussy, Nijinsky-inspired poem published in the New Republic was significant and surely seemed portentous to the young poet, who would soon himself would write criticism, as Young did. Faulkner's poem is not a translation of Mallarmé's poem, but rather his own take on the provocative concept of an afternoon of a faun dreaming away about nymphs. The idea of a faun took powerful hold for Faulkner in that hybrid creature of ancient worlds whose clacking hooves sounded a delicate mystery. The young man found a compelling figure of one who does and does not fit in, caught between two species. The sexual prowess and frustration of the faun riveted the young man whose sweetheart, Estelle, had bowed to family pressure and married a promising young attorney instead of eloping with her true love, Faulkner. or so the story is. The faun was appearing in other poems Faulkner was writing, which he would lengthen into his first book of poetry, The Marble Faun, published in 1924. At the same time, Faulkner was producing translations for local publications, most of them of poems by Paul Verlaine, who contributed his own voice to La Belle Epoque. Faulkner's rendering of Fantoche got him mocked by local wags, who now were calling him Count No Count in Oxford because of his dandified way of dressing and adopting a pose of aesthete that found little acceptance in the provincial Mississippi town. The younger writer / poser also translated Clair de Lune by Verlaine, also again veering toward Debussy. His short piece of that name also, and that I should say, the Debussy also embodies the sound of young Faulkner. Part of what enabled Faulkner's producing these translations was his taking courses at the University of Mississippi as a special student, because he was a veteran of the Great War. And I should pause to say that he was not a veteran of the Great War in the sense that Dos Passos maybe was. He faked an English accent and put a U in his name and went up to Canada to join the Royal Canadian Air Force. And there he just was a cadet. He just trained as a cadet. He never even flew a plane. But he did come back to Mississippi, having purchased wings for his uniform and claiming that he had crashed his plane, but not. He was still able to get a bottle of whiskey out and take a sip. He also claimed to have a metal plate in his head, and he had a little bit of a limp. But anyway, this is how he got into school at the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss. And there he excelled in French classes. He barely passed English, but he did do very well in English, made A's. Now, while a student at Ole Miss, he joined a theatrical club, and this club was called the Marionettes. And the university's interest in drama, this interest had really been stoked by Stark Young several years earlier. Now, Faulkner, while he was there, wrote a play by the same name, The Marionettes, and he lettered it, he illustrated it, and he bound the book himself. Now, the writing follows very much in the vein of Oscar Wilde's Salome, with a number of very formal kind of repetitions in the dialogue. The illustrations follow directly, as you can see, in the style of Aubrey Beardsley, with their sharp lines and uses of contrasting black and white spaces. And he was doing other illustrations, Faulkner, for the university's yearbook at this time along these same lines. The play style. The play's action brings into play dream states, following the stock character Poirot, whose beloved Marietta rejects him. Published in 1920, this play has received more attention. I say published, written in that time, has received attention recently by Candace Wade and Judah Sinzabar and others, but it is typically regarded as atypical apprentice work. And this is really the heart of what I am trying to look at. How it is that, or this at least is one way to come to grips with the 1920s Faulkner, who really in many ways is a reluctant modernist. Now, the same could be said in terms of thinking of these early works as being atypical of the book I mentioned a little bit ago, The Marble Faun. But when viewed in context of the 1920s Faulkner, a Faulkner, we'll say, who died on January the 1st, 1930, this 1924 volume takes on a more nuanced meaning. It's published by Vanity Press. It featured a preface by Faulkner's best friend and de facto mentor, Phil Stone. The poetry remains in the Belle Epoque style, albeit grounded in an implied presence, since the faun is actually a marble statue in a garden who opines, we'll say this, he is very upset that he cannot escape his rigid marble form and be the fluid, sexually driven, natural self that he has. But what's interesting is that Stone's preface clashes with the style of the poetry, a style that is more along the lines of La Belle Epoque. And one almost wonders if Stone was thinking about prefacing some other Faulkner book. This is what Stone writes to begin. He says, "These are primarily the poems of youth and a simple heart. They are the poems of a mind that reacts directly to sunlight and trees and blue hills, reacts without evasion of self-consciousness. The author of these poems is a man steeped in the soil of his native land, a Southerner by every instinct, and more than that, a Mississippian. Now, these are striking statements that offer an unexpected gloss on the poetry, for in fact, little to nothing in the actual poetry reveals specificity of place or anything significantly Southern or Mississippian, whatever those things may actually mean. At this point, Faulkner had not yet even met Sherwood Anderson, much less committed himself to writing of his home. I think Stone's comments are best understood as stating who he wanted Faulkner to be as a writer. Stone and Faulkner's friendship had begun around 1914, 1915, and had grown steadily, with Faulkner going to live with Stone in New Haven, Connecticut. It's always kind of a hard word for me to say. Anyway, this was after Estelle had married another man. Faulkner and she were allegedly going to elope, but she ended up marrying a person more befitting her social state, her social level. Stone got Faulkner reading Swinburne and Housman, and it was he who first introduced Faulkner to Stark Young. Stone followed developments in the literary world with passion, and he grew keenly aware of the transition from the romance of the pre-Great War era to the world-weary cynicism of the 1920s, which would seem the turning point from La Belle Epoque to modernism. And I'm well aware that trying to draw sharp lines between different movements or moments is really rather futile. Anyway, Stone got Faulkner also, though, reading Sherwood Anderson, Amy Lowell, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, other modernists, and Anderson and Joyce and others like them. Stone discerned the more local direction literary art was taking, or at least the power of the local as envisioned in modernism. And in his preface to the Marble Faun, he also wrote, quote, George Moore said that all universal art became great by being first provincial. And the sunlight and mockingbirds and blue hills of North Mississippi are part of this young man's very being. This turn toward the local and realism that both Stone and Anderson urged would indeed famously take place for Faulkner, no doubt. But in Faulkner himself, I think, can be found a resistance to this turn based in allegiance to the principles of the art of the moment in which he came of age. An insight into Faulkner's mentality appears in his 1920 review of William Alexander Percy's In April Once. In it, Faulkner writes, Mr. Percy, like, alas, how many of us, suffered the misfortune of having been born out of his time. He should have lived in Victorian England and gone to Italy with Swinburne, for like Swinburne, he is a mixture of passionate adoration of beauty and as passionate a despair and disgust with its manifestations and accessories in the human race. Faulkner then went on to decry the dark of modernity, which threatens the bright simplicity and the colorful romantic pageantry of the Middle Ages with which his eyes are full. This young Faulkner, embarking on the decade following the Great War, seems arguably not so interested in modernism. Despite Stone's efforts to frame the Marble Faun as a work of local-based literature, Faulkner's poem itself appears resolutely based on the art of a different age in which the contemporary moment suffers by comparison, against which it suffers by comparison. Of course, it is the tension between ancient beauty and modernist ugliness and alienation that drove the works of Eliot, Joyce, and so many others. The Marble Faun can readily be pointed to as a step toward Faulkner's capturing that tension, which put him in line with the larger sensibilities of the Southern Renaissance, with its stepping into modernity with a backward glance, as Alan Tate stated. Likewise, it is natural for an artist's perspective to grow more realist, cynical, and aware as youth passes into adulthood and middle age, but Faulkner's career is often viewed through the lens of his so-called great period, which was decidedly one of the 1930s. This viewpoint rejoices with some relief that Faulkner outgrew his silly, non-local, non-specific, non-historicized, youthful writing about fauns and nymphs to become a great modernist artist who was grappling with philosophical situations of his moment, race in the South and in the country of the United States, disability, and so many other things. But here's my question: how happy was Faulkner to, quote, grow up? In January 1925, a month after The Marble Faun was published, Faulkner went to New Orleans, where he intended to take a ship to Europe. Instead, he stayed in the French Quarter, initially with Sherwood Anderson, whom he had met on a brief trip to the city the month before. Here he is with Elizabeth Prawl, for whom Faulkner had worked in New York City. Faulkner undoubtedly, I want to be clear, undoubtedly admired Anderson, and he saw undoubtedly the power of autochthonous writing, especially as being envisioned in this modernist moment. Just how much Faulkner came under the spell of Anderson's incessant talking in New Orleans is not clear, but certainly he heard it. And in that bohemian setting, Faulkner absorbed these modernist sensibilities. He began to write prose sketches that experimented with plot, perhaps drawing on his reading, however, of Dickens' sketches of London, which had set that writer on his fabulous career as a novelist. Faulkner soon himself began writing a novel, which he entitled May Day. It depicted a situation in which a wounded veteran, a pose, again, that Faulkner had taken, has come back to his hometown in Georgia, not in Mississippi, and it deals with how the people in his life grapple with the fact of his dying. The novel opened with some smart and ironic dialogue among soldiers on the train home, but the second chapter was set in a rectory garden and presented dialogue between the dying soldier's father and a character named Janarius Jones, having a face that was, quote, a round mirror before which fauns and nymphs might have wantoned when the world was young. Quote, end of quote. James is himself a kind of faun, his eyes clear and yellow, obscene, and old in sin as a goat's. When the soldier's father suggests that after age 31, people should do nothing but eat, sleep, and procreate, Jones hopes he might be able to arrange that for the world. And he wants to be 31 forever, and his amorous antics later reveal him to be the marble faun, escaped. To note that Faulkner held on to the faun image well into his professional career as a novelist is hardly original. But where many have seen the development of Faulkner's working with that figure as a sign of his growing into a more sophisticated artist, I see perhaps maybe rather someone who saw adopting modernist techniques and viewpoints as a capitulation to marketing, careerism, and conformity. Now, let me just say, modernist techniques and viewpoints as capitulation to marketing, that makes for a very strange sounding sentence, I realize. That modernism cannot be farther in many ways from conformity to mainstream culture of the 1920s. But I think that as an artist, Faulkner was fiercely independent, and as a person resistant to the crass noise of modernism. It is my view that he was reluctant to conform even to nonconformity of the modernist brand, eager and ready as he was to conform to Belle Epoque standards. While it has often seemed to Faulkner scholarship that Faulkner steadily and determinedly, if not necessarily blithely, grew into a modernist, it seems to me that from a viewpoint of following Faulkner's career forward rather than looking back upon it, one could argue that he eroded into a modernist. I'll say this way. Instead of looking at him as a Nobel Prize winner, seeing him from the viewpoint of what he became and how he has been viewed since his death, which shows him developing into a modernist, I wonder if we might think of him as more, from his viewpoint, looking at his career moving forward as eroding into a modernist. Now, biographical arguments are notoriously difficult to make, I well know. But I've gone this far, and I continue toward my conclusion shortly by focusing on a figuration that binds Faulkner's works in this momentum of what might be thought of as erosion into modernism. That figuration comes from Mallarmé's L'après-midi d'une femme. The poem closes in English translation with these lines: "Oh, certain punishment! No, but the soul, void of words, and this heavy body succumb to noon's proud silence slowly. With no more ado, forgetting blasphemy, I must sleep, lying on the thirsty sand, and as I love, open my mouth to wine's true constellation. Farewell to you both. I go to see the shadow you have become." Striking final image of going to the shadow. that the nymph has become. That's a very striking image to me. That imagery and that motion of going to that shadow seemed to have arisen in Faulkner's mind as he visited the geographical heart of La Belle Epoque, Paris, in the latter half of 1925. He finally did get that boat to Europe, and he went to Paris and spent time there. And while there, he was definitely moving in one of the great centers of Bohemian modernism. While there, he discovered that Anderson's publisher, Bonnie and Liveright, had accepted his novel Mayday, but they had retitled it Soldier's Pay, an ironic title befitting the readership of the moment. It's a more modernist kind of title. But Faulkner himself wrote something else with the name Mayday in the meantime. When he returned to New Orleans in January 1926, he presented Helen Baird, a woman with whom he was very much in love at that time, with another hand-bound book written and illustrated by himself. It was a short work of Arthurian romance, bearing the title his novel had originally worn, Mayday. It was as though he must accept the realities of publishing in the real world with his novel, but he would preserve his aesthetic principles in producing a work for someone he loved. Now, in this story, a knight named Sir Gawain of Arthgyle seeks a woman of whom he has dreamed. Pain and hunger, who appear as shades, accompany him on his quest. Hunger explains that life is, quote, ceaseless fretting to gain shadows to which there is no substance, end of quote. After encountering a succession of women, but not finding the one of whom he dreams, Sir Gawain finds himself at the bank of a stream where a man there tells him to choose either to go into the water and drown or cross the stream and continue in life. There follows a Platonic discussion of the ontology of shadows, very much along the lines of Plato's allegory of the cave, in which this man talking to Sir Gawain, raises the question of whether or not Sir Gawain has always been a shadow. Sir Gawain he finds that he can finally attain the woman of his dreams, but he has to do so by ceasing to be, ultimately it seems, a shadow and drowning. And there he will meet this woman who is referred to as Little Sister Death. Now, this may set off some kind of recognition for you for this very important work of Faulkner's that is upcoming. But even as Faulkner produced Mayday, he was writing rather quickly his next novel, Mosquitoes, and this one reproduced Sherwood Anderson's holding forth on art to his group of acolytes in New Orleans. This was another book Faulkner was writing about ideas, maybe not exactly writing to sell, but certainly writing in a way that was trying to make sense, I think, of his moment. It was also in this time that Anderson gave his famous advice about going and writing about that patch in northern Mississippi he knew about. And in fact, Faulkner did so, at least in his mind and heart, writing Flags in the Dust, which he would later call the germ of his Apocrypha. He now wrote out of the specificity of his location, his home location, in ways immediately and profoundly recognizable. He believed the novel to be a great book, this Flags in the Dust, and it did include the character Horace Bimbo, who in so many ways embodied the aesthete living out of his natural time. Publisher after publisher rejected the manuscript for its lack of focus. Only after more capitulation to editors in the publishing industry did the novel appear in truncated form and retitled Sartorus in 1929. It was during this painful process that Faulkner later wrote, "Something happened. I sent the book," he said, "from publisher to publisher with a kind of stubborn and fading hope of at least justifying the paper I had used and the time I had spent writing it. This hope must have died at last, because one day it suddenly seemed as if a door had clapped silently and forever between me and all publishers' addresses and book lists, and I said to myself, now I can write." End of quote. The writing he did at that point became The Sound and the Fury, and he claimed it began with the image of a little sister's muddy drawers. One of this girl's brothers is named Quentin, and as scholars have well noted, he greatly resembles Sir Gawain of Arthgyle. On the last day of his life, he walks around with a little Italian girl in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge, Massachusetts. He calls her Little Sister, The section of the novel Quentin narrates opens with the words, "When the shadow of the sash appears on the curtains, it was between 7 and 8 o'clock." And the section ends shortly before he drowns himself, going into the river, much as Sir Gawain of Arthgyle does, without making the heavy-handed mistake of equating Quentin too closely with Faulkner as a person. I believe it can well be argued that the character's death represents the death of 1920s Belle Epoque Faulkner. In one of 2 introductions Faulkner later wrote for the novel, he goes into great length to discuss how the South was bereft of art in comparison to the North. It was in this introduction that he wrote the words I quoted a moment ago about when he begins to write. And he went on to say in this introduction that the writing of the Benji section, narrated by a cognitively disabled man who can hear but cannot speak, brought him a one-time experience, Faulkner, but that the experience is, quote, ecstasy, that eager and joyous faith and anticipation of surprise which the yet unmarred sheets beneath my hand held inviolate and unfailing will not return. Faulkner concluded that introduction in the following way. He wrote, "There is a story somewhere about an old Roman who kept at his bedside a Tyrrhenian vase which he loved, and the rim of which he wore away slowly with kissing it. I had made myself a vase, but I suppose I knew all the time that I could not live forever inside of it, that perhaps to have it so that I too could lie in bed and look at it would be better. Surely so, when that day should come when not only the ecstasy of writing would be gone, but the unreluctance and the something worth saying too. It's fine to think you will leave something behind you when you die, but it's better to have made something you can die with." End of quote. Viewed from the viewpoint of a 1920s Faulkner, the imagery of these comments points to a distinct ending, a death. Faulkner might just as easily have referred to Dorian Gray's portrait in this entwining of life and art. The novel's title comes from Shakespeare's Macbeth, the soliloquy Macbeth delivers upon hearing of Lady Macbeth's death. Of course, death plays such a large role in so much literature that one must take care in how one interprets it. But there is something different about The Sound and the Fury and the conditions of its production in Faulkner's career. And death takes on a particular resonance with the novel Faulkner wrote next. Immediately upon completing The Sound of the Fury, Faulkner had written Sanctuary, but publishers Cape and Smith had declared it too shocking to publish. So I'm not including it so much as a novel envisioned as being published maybe by the end of 1929. In other words, Faulkner maybe would not have known that. Faulkner rather moved on, writing all night while working as a night watchman at the University of Mississippi power plant. Now he was married to Estelle, who had divorced her husband, and married Faulkner in July, although they had a very troubling honeymoon. In fact, it seems that she may have tried to drown herself on the Gulf Coast. Faulkner had dependence. He would need to provide. He would have to, on some level, he would need to try to think about his readers. But he wrote what he thought would be one last masterpiece of pure art. The title he gave it, As I Lay Dying, he took from Homer's Odyssey, the quote coming wherein Agamemnon tells Odysseus, "As I lay dying, the woman with the dog's eyes would not close my eyes as I descended into Hades." The title casts the novel in the perspective of Addie Bundren, who dies in the novel. But the quote from which it is taken harkens back to another poet of La Belle Epoque, Arthur Rimbaud. Friend and lover of Verlaine, Rimbaud published A Season in Hell in 1873 at age 19, and the next year quit writing altogether. Although alive, he ceased to be a producer of literature at age 20, turning instead to travel in his 20s. The military he was involved in also, and ultimately he had a career in business. Although he lived 17 more years, Rimbaud died. He died as an artist there as he began his 20s. Hell may not exactly be Hades, but the quote seems so striking from the Odyssey for a man, Faulkner, whose artistic vision and hope had played itself out in The Sound of the Fury, and who brought his full powers on a book that, as he put it, merely exercised those powers in As I Lay Dying. I'm certainly not the first to try and understand Faulkner's career as it unfolded. Gary Lee Stoneham, argues that Faulkner learned something from each novel that he then built the succeeding novel around. And in his biography, Becoming Faulkner, Philip Weinstein comes to grips with Faulkner's disappointments and uncertainties as he traces Faulkner's career according to how it seemed to him as it unfolded. This included many doubts and uncertainties. In the thoughts I have presented, I add to these scholars' observations by arguing that while history did indeed play out in such a way that 1930 marked the beginning of Faulkner's career as we know it, there is also a very real sense in which it was the culmination and possibly even disappointing end of what Faulkner had originally set out to do. I use the word disappointing in quotes, not only to show awareness that the novel is regarded, The Sound and the Fury, as a masterpiece of modernism, but also because Faulkner himself called it his greatest failure. He discussed that failure as an attempt at something so great it must fail, and that the failure was a badge of honor. But I think it could also be argued that the novel failed precisely because it was a masterpiece of modernism and not a masterpiece of the principles of La Belle Epoque. Insofar as Faulkner infused his aesthetics with deep ponderings on race, region, disability, language, ontology, epistemology, and so many other factors that so many scholars have dealt with, The Sound and the Fury is a far richer novel than anything he had written before his 1920s career, no doubt. The complicated and paradoxical adult Faulkner had become by 1929 could not help but see the world in the frameworks he did. But that very achievement, as we see it, marked the end of Faulkner's beautiful epoch. Thank you very much, everybody. I do appreciate it so much. And I will go ahead and escape here and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so very much, Professor Hagood. That was a beautiful presentation. And I will add Professor Curnutt to the stream.
Great, thank you. Well, those were both wonderful presentations, and I want to echo the thanks of my co-presenters on saying thank you for having me to this wonderful conference. It'll have been 40 years ago in August that I hopped a plane to Brazil and spent a year in the state of Sao Paulo as a exchange student up in the city of Jales, if any of you are familiar with that. And so to receive this invitation is really like the homecoming I've never been quite able to have since then. And I want to thank two of our Fitzgerald Society members who have done more than anybody else to promote Fitzgerald studies in Brazil, Roberto Fabri Viscardi and Marcela Lanius. I don't think they're probably watching, but I just want to say thank you to them for all the great work that they have done. This is a update of a work that I did that's coming out in the new edition of the Cambridge Companion to Fitzgerald, and it was really an effort to synthesize and redeem, I think, what is a common dismissal of him into maybe another angle of modernism that we don't necessarily recognize. So this is about Fitzgerald's age consciousness. In November 1923, Metropolitan magazine, a periodical that would shortly cease publication after 30 years, printed an interview with the title, F. Scott Fitzgerald says all women over 35 should be murdered. To say the least, this is one of the more incendiary gauntlets thrown down in the battle between generations that he waged in the first 5 years of his career before The Great Gatsby in 1925. But the headline would not have particularly shocked an audience in that period. Indeed, it might be said to summarize Fitzgerald's entire corpus, for the theme of youth so saturates his fiction that motifs of aging are arguably more central to his sensibility than the intangibility of the American dream, or the Jazz Age's attenuating values, or the ruptures of modernity. At its most personal, age was meant for him as a measure of self-worth. As long as he believed he was young, he embodied the promise of early achievement. I was always interested in prodigies because I almost became one, he recollected at the ripe old age of 23, comparing himself to the real-life phenom James William Sidis, who inspired his debut story in the Saturday Evening Post, Head and Shoulders. I think I was one of the 10 youngest in my class at Princeton. 17 years later, in a piece called Early Success, he described why he valued precocity over maturity. The man who arrives young believes he exercises his will because his star is shining. The man who only asserts himself at 30 has a balanced idea of what power and fate have each contributed, and the one who gets there at 40 is liable to put the emphasis on will alone. Even before Fitzgerald's premature death in 1940, John Peel Bishop remembered how his former Princeton pal believed that he must produce from an early age. I complained to him that I thought he took 17 as his norm, making everything later a falling off. For a moment he demurred and said, "If you make it 15, I'll agree with you." Fitzgerald's short stories and his fiction, his novels, frequently climax with characters feeling prematurely pushed out to pasture. For these two, life had come quickly and gone, leaving not bitterness but pity, not disillusionment but only pain, in a short story called The Lees of Happiness. The characters there are all of 36. The ending to this 1920 short story foreshadows that of a 1920 piece called At Your Age, in which the protagonist realizes that he has, quote, lost the battle against youth and spring, and with his grief paid the penalty for age's unforgivable sin, refusing to die. Well, at least there the character is 50. And scores of similar lines could be cited from a variety of other works. Critics typically speak of these age anxieties as evidence of his immaturity. In Early Success, he recalls confronting New York Tribune columnist Haywood Broun for dismissing his flappers as superficial brats. I told him that it was too bad he'd let his life slide away without accomplishing anything. He'd just turned 30 and it was about then that I wrote a line that certain people will not let me forget. Quote, "She was a faded but still lovely woman of 27. The self-deflation here is indicative of an ambivalence toward youth the commentators don't always appreciate in him. Long before his 30th birthday, Fitzgerald had tired of being typecast as the juvenile of the jeunesse jazz, as the New York Morning Telegraph mocked him in 1922. He no sooner declared in 1920 that an author ought to write for the youth of his own generation, the critics of the next, and the schoolmasters of ever afterward, that he satirized a pompous and significantly older writer, Richard Caramel, by making him utter this same exact pontifical epigram in The Beautiful and Damned. 1922 essay, What I Think and Feel at 25, meanwhile, lampoons the media's simplistic conception of his age obsession by forcing him to quell a rumor that, quote, you and Miss Fitzgerald are going to commit suicide at 30 because you hate and dread middle age. As late as An Afternoon of an Author in 1936, he recalls a review of Tender is the Night that brought him to tears for describing him as living at high speed and fond of nightclubs, an image that completely undermined his maturing artistry. It was like in the beginning, 15 years ago, he writes, when they said he had a fatal facility, and he labored like a slave over every sentence so as not to be like that. I'm getting bitter again. That's no good. That's no good. Fitzgerald doesn't mention this, but in the same review from Time magazine, it compliments him for looking younger than at his age, 37, perhaps because it also dubs him a perpetual undergraduate and, quote, the bad boy of U.S. letters. All of which is to say that as invested as Fitzgerald was in the idea of youth, he was critical enough to interrogate his attachment to it and challenge the ways that it stereotyped him. A more pervasive defense than dismissing his detractors as old fogies, however, might have been to argue that his age consciousness reflected the broader fetishization of youth that transformed attitudes toward both growing up and growing older. Resisting the biological inevitability of aging, after all, is a transcultural preoccupation traceable back to the earliest known myths by which human beings have confronted their mortality. The search for the fountain of youth is perhaps the more durable of these legends. Yet conceptions of the life cycle are also insistently historical, with the value of youth perpetually shifting. Fitzgerald's age consciousness should have recognized that Fitzgerald's age, or his era, should have recognized that his age consciousness was a product of modernity's transformations, not a personal susceptibility. The term youth meant to him more than just an abstract marker of age, or as a convenient synonym for jazz age vivacity, female beauty, or romantic promise. In the beginning, it was a platform by which he could claim the mantle of generational spokesman. At the same time, it was his target market, his own personal public. More significantly, his empathy for young people inspired him to modernize the representation of adolescence in ways I still don't think he gets the credit he deserves for. And in doing so, his depiction of his generation's initiation rites led to one of the most peculiar treatments of sexuality among modernists. Although Fitzgerald became famous for portraying young people as wild, his characters are often conspicuously chaste even when they promiscuously pet. He may have cataloged what one reviewer derided as, quote, the osculatory habits of the flapper, but his discretion regarding carnal knowledge results in characters that are part child and part adult. As such, his conflicted sensibility suggests that for all his references to age milestones, the meaning of maturity for him was inexact, making the stability that becoming a grown-up promises one more casualty of modern uncertainty. While he would probably not go so far as the recent provocative headline of a study of aging in American literature, just recently published, Adulthood is a Fiction, he would be hard-pressed to define what exactly makes it a fact. Well, from the moment he rose to fame with This Side of Paradise in 1920, F. Scott Fitzgerald projected a tension about maturity that would become the defining image of 20th century adolescence. On the one hand, the supposed compromises and hypocrisies of the adult world give young people little reason to rush into maturity. On the other hand, because youth is a perishable commodity, doomed to be used up and exhausted by chronology, there's been a constant effort to preserve it, to resist aging. The result is a liminality that, it's important to note, Fitzgerald didn't invent. It can be found in the commentary of predecessors like G. Stanley Hall, whose monumental 2-volume work, Adolescence, from 1903 and 4, is peppered with assertions that glamorize youth while acknowledging its indirection. Quote, gifted people seem to conserve their youth and to be all the more intensely adolescents because of their gifts. And it's certainly one of the marks of genius that the plasticity and spontaneity of adolescence persists into maturity. Sometimes its passions, reveries, and hoydenish freaks continue. It's also important to note how this attitude differs from, say, the inherent adult perspective of coming-of-age stories like Willa Cather's Paul's Case, a work that Fitzgerald adored despite its implicit critique of its main character's delusions, or her My Antonia, in which an older narrator looks back with nostalgia, or perhaps even more relevantly, the popular novels of Booth Tarkington, who, as Fitzgerald's most recent biographer David S. Brown notes, portrayed young adulthood with condescending whimsy as a safe place before the inevitable complexities of life take hold. Tarkington novels such as Penrod and 17 from the 1910s are youth as parents would like to think of the young. Rather, Fitzgerald emphasized adolescent uncertainties, often chastising adult readers for not remembering the deep pain of growing up. Even in a fizzy social comedy such as Bernice Bobs Her Hair, He was wont to slip in a little reminder of how stodgy adult thinking can be. Quote, people over 40 can seldom be permanently convinced of anything. At 18, our convictions are hills from which we look, and at 45, they're caves in which we hide. Fitzgerald's regard for youth would extend even into the mid-1930s, when his instinct for short story structure would falter and his relationship with the Saturday Evening Post came to an end. Nevertheless, in one of his final Post stories, he portrayed 13-year-old Gwen Bowers and her circle of girlfriends without rendering them silly or frivolous in the way that most American culture does young women. One passage describes a curious soberness that overtakes the girls, otherwise giddy rat-a-tat-tat with laughter, as they gossip about boys. Quote, they faced both ways toward a world which they were fast leaving and a world they had never met, and the contradiction was externalized in the uncanny mirth. Fitzgerald might have called this story too cute for words, but he didn't portray his teenagers in any of his works as cutesy. The flip side of this empathy was Fitzgerald's use of what literary criticism would soon come to call the initiation story, the plot in which a young person loses his or her innocence. For several protagonists, including Amory Blaine in This Side of Paradise, Jim Powell in the Southern short story The Jelly Bean, or George Kelly in a story called The Sensible Thing, a failed love brings about the transience of desire, insight into the transience of desire. In other cases, whether Anthony Patch in The Beautiful and Damned or Charlie Wales in Babylon Revisited, they fall prey to dissipation and grow nostalgic for the carefree fun of younger days. Fitzgerald was far from the only modernist, of course, to avail himself of the initiation story. Its probably most famous example is James Joyce's Araby, which became the most recognizable of modernist plots, especially in the short story, in part because the sudden delivery into adult experience provided a compelling end-driven form for dramatizing the shape of consciousness, a little trick we all know as the epiphany. But whereas contemporaries portrayed that lost quality of innocence, Fitzgerald almost always speaks of it as youth, and he forces his heroes to feel suddenly and irrevocably old. Thus, the conclusion of Winter Dreams employs explicit Felix Culpa imagery when Dexter Green learns that Judy Jones's beauty has faded. Quote, the dream was gone. Something had been taken from him. The gates were closed, the sun gone down. There was no beauty but the gray beauty of steel that withstands all time. Even the grief he could have borne was left behind in the country of illusion, of youth, the richness of life, where his winter dreams had flourished. For Fitzgerald, few plot peaks were more cathartic than the sudden realization that youth was a paradise lost. The consistency with which the epiphany occurs should not, however, minimize its variety. The protagonist may be a young woman as well as a young man. In a story called Emotional Bankruptcy, for example, Josephine Perry suffers the awful realization that her frivolousness has exhausted her capacity for passion. The character may be even an older woman, such as in The Cut Glass Bowl from 1920, when by 35, Evelyn Piper realizes that while once she might have embodied youth and love, the springs of affection have slowly dried up and her desire to drink again of them was dead. Or it may be even an older man, Dick Diver in Tender as the Night is 40, when he realizes that he is, quote, not young anymore, with a lot of nice thoughts and dreams to have about himself. In at least one case, a major character realizes that if youth is going to be lost, one might as well have fun exhausting it. I regretted my lost youth when I only envied the delights of losing it, Amory Blaine confesses at the end of Paradise, This Side of Paradise. I don't want to repeat my lost innocence. I want the pleasure of using it again. In this instance, Fitzgerald offered a wry, self-aware perspective on what would become the cri de coeur of the youth gone wild subgenre of coming-of-age fiction. the idea that wasting one's youth is the only possible agency young people possess in a world that fails to provide meaningful reasons to grow up. The age range among characters banished from youth dramatizes the general confusion in the modern era about the reliability of milestones and institutions defining adulthood. Age itself was one such marker of the structuring of the stages of life. As Howard Chudakoff has demonstrated, the more cohort stratified American society became through schooling and career notions of the ladder of success, the more 20th century popular discourse fixated upon chronological guideposts, quote, to categorize individual experience and to express norms by which individuals measured themselves against their peers. So an essay like What I Think and Feel is 25 belongs to a genre of personal essay in which writers define birthdays as benchmarks of psychological growth. Not surprisingly, the more pronounced this trend became, the sharper the backlash. As Sadie Edelstein writes, the flagrant refusals to abide by expectations of age appropriateness fueled expectations to unmoor age from socially sanctioned versions of maturity and cast into relief the project of maturity itself as somewhat suspect. Fitzgerald, however, was not a foot soldier in this battle. His instinct was to maroon characters between a desire to be guided by these norms and a melancholy recognition that maturity was too intangible to guarantee fulfillment or stability. So in one of his best short stories, The Rich Boy, Anson Hunter possesses every attribute that should make him a man: a successful career, a plush inheritance, social standing, even an exacting sense of propriety. Yet he remains emotionally adrift, incapable of romantic mutuality due to an innate sense of superiority that leaves him needing women, quote, responding to him like filings to a magnet, spending their brightest, freshest, and rarest hours to nurse and protect his vanity. Anson is more complex than an aging playboy or a bachelor clinging to youth, even if the story ends with him, like many men, pursuing a much younger woman. He ends up with the fussy pessimism of a man of 40 in other areas of his life, but he refuses to settle down. Fitzgerald wants to blame this condition on his wealth, but the boy in the title is as important as the rich. Anson cannot imagine any satisfaction in settling down, as adults are expected to do, despite the loneliness he suffers. He recognizes that in society's eyes, he's not a man until he relinquishes the very thing that makes him happiest, the promise of new female adoration. And he can only exercise his chief preoccupation, the fact that he was 30 years old, by abandoning New York, his principality, for Europe, while he will not be pressured to grow up. Commentators in the 1920s disagreed on what exact age should mark adulthood. That's still true today, I would say. G. Stanley Hall defined adolescence as extending from 14 to 24. Sterner conservative commentators tended to reinforce legal definitions. So, for example, marriage at 18 or for men, or 21 for women. Progressive psychologists promoted greater lenience by arguing that young adulthood, as opposed to the pejorative extended adolescence, lasted deep into one's 20s. Up to 1926, for reasons that are obvious for someone born in 1896, Fitzgerald tended to fixate on 30 as the milestone that marked the turning point into the midlife. When the New Yorker profiled him in the spring of 1926, John C. Mosher focused on his looming birthday. Scott feels he's getting on in years and he's no longer young. It weighs upon him, troubles him. He's almost 30. Seldom has he allowed a person of such advanced age to enter his books. Almost dutifully, Fitzgerald poked fun at his reputation. I've written a story, he admits, probably referring to The Rich Boy. It's not about the younger generation. The hero is 29. Yet Moser grossly oversimplifies for the sake of his quip. In The Great Gatsby, you'll remember that Nick Carraway interrupts the battle at the Plaza Hotel between Gatsby and Tom Buchanan over Daisy with an odd declaration. I suddenly remembered it's my birthday. I'm 30. Nick here is aware of the need to uphold the age-appropriate, self-critical insight that other characters, especially the romantic Gatsby, lack. I'm 30, he later tells Jordan Baker when she accuses him of the secret pride of believing himself an honest person. I'm 5 years too old to call myself honest and to lie to myself and call it an honor. Yet this maturity chafes against the opposing Halseyan notion that aging saps vitality. 30, Nick laments, the promise of a decade of loneliness, a thinning list of single men to know, a thinning briefcase of enthusiasm, thinning hair. Up through his 30th birthday, Fitzgerald was apt to interrupt his plots with windy plates on middle age that foreshadow Nick's worry. The years between 35 and 65 revolve between the passive mind and one as one unexplained, confusing merry-go-round, reads an entirely superfluous interjection in 1922's O Russet Witch, a merry-go-round of ill-gated and wind-broken horses. For most men and women, these 30 years are taken up with a gradual withdrawal from life, a retreat from a front of many shelters, those myriad amusements and curiosities of youth. The Beautiful and Damned is rife with these kinds of intrusive observations about life after 30. Indeed, in this most deterministic of novels, Fitzgerald uses age milestones as a central measure of ruin, whipping up his plot into a veritable bloodbath of growing old. By the novel's end, Gloria and Anthony Patch have prematurely aged themselves, leaving Gloria gasping in the mirror, declaring, "I didn't think I looked 30," and the alcoholic Anthony subject to this withering judgment. He was 33, but he looked 40. For obvious reasons, such assertions tend to disappear for Fitzgerald after 1927. But in stories such as At Your Age, Jacob's Ladder, and Magnetism, a romantic attraction to a much younger woman upends a man's sense of the connection between his chronological age and his emotional maturity, raising anxieties that he'll behave undignified by failing to act his age. Perhaps the most intriguing realm in which Fitzgerald tried to map the boundaries between youth and adulthood was sexuality. His early notoriety arose from the flagrancy with which he celebrated petting, a term that haunted him, trailed him throughout his life, a term that could refer not just to kissing, but to a spectrum of non-coital intimacies. He delighted early on in taunting elders with his generation's recreational kissing. From this side of paradise insistence that Victorian mothers have no idea how casually their daughters are accustomed to being kissed, to the claim in Bernice Bobs Her Hair that unsuspecting dowagers monitor country club dance floors, not realizing that the more popular dangerous girls are being kissed in parked limousines. Fitzgerald's lifestyle commentaries frequently advocate petting as an introduction to life that will lessen the roving tendency after marriage, because experienced brides are less liable after marriage to cruise here and there, seeking a lover more romantic than her husband, as he writes in a piece known as "Why Blame It on the Poor Kiss If the Young Woman Roams?" Elsewhere, he applies this ethos to sex education in general. In Echoes of the Jazz Age, he credits several explicit 1920s works alongside this Side of Paradise, from James Branch Cable's Jurgen to D.H. Lawrence Lady Chatterley's Lover, with promoting premarital intimacy as far healthier than Victorian repression. Perhaps many women found that love was supposed to be fun, he suggests, of their honest and elucidating effect. What's interesting to me is that fun sex seems to be in short supply in his work. To be sure, there's plenty of pleasurable kissing. Even in The Beautiful and Damned, his least romantic novel, he titles an entire section The Connoisseur of Kisses. In Tender as the Night, his most psychologically fraught novel, he requires Dick Diver to gasp lines straight out of romance fiction. "My God," a young Dick declares to his patient and future wife, Nicole Warren, "you're fun to kiss." Writing in the thick of the 1960s sexual revolution, Leslie Fiedler credited the sometimes cloying kissing tableau to Fitzgerald's obsession with youth, citing them as proof of his inability to grapple with what he called consummated genital love, probably the least romantic phrase ever. But his resistance to the emotional and reproductive responsibilities of adulthood. The adolescent's kiss is the only climax his imagination can imagine, the only one his imagination can really encompass. It's the only climax he ever realizes in a scene. However dismissive, the claim raises valid questions about Fitzgerald's more romantic moments. Are we really to believe in a short story like The Offshore Pirate that Argita Farnham and her supposed on-the-lam kidnapper, Curtis Carlyle, who turns out to be her boyfriend, Toby Moreland, that they're satisfied to restrict their amorous adventures to French kissing during a 3-day idyll on a chaperoneless island? Or that John T. Unger and Kiss Mine Washington never do more than canoodle during a, quote, month of blanket nights and warm glowing days shared in the shadow of the fantastical Jewel Mountain and the Diamond as Big as the Ritz? Or that Josephine Perry, a debutante that he wrote several stories about, who earns a reputation as a speed for compulsively throwing herself at men who should be off limits, including her sister's fiancé, that she's really just a promiscuous kisser? One might argue that the chastity in Fitzgerald's stories reflects the prudish dictates of the Saturday Evening Post, where he published the majority of his short stories. Because the rich boy acknowledges that Anson Hunter is sexually active, for example, it had to appear in Red Book instead of America's most popular periodical. Yet perhaps more than mere consummation, what Fiedler means is sexual maturity. That is, if we attribute to adulthood the sexual self-possession by which we weigh pleasures with consequences while respecting partner's dignity. This element is what seems to elude Fitzgerald, with the result that characters are not only sexually unfulfilled, but the gender biases inherent in traditional sexual practices are rarely challenged. Whatever their fault, coming-of-age novels like This Side of Paradise inspired in the early 1920s, such as Floyd Dell's Mooncalf or Janet March, promote free love as empowering maturation. And I find Janet March particularly interesting because it has an entirely untraumatic approach to abortion. Janet March has one. She calmly arranges it and, in the words of W. Tasker Witham, apparently finds the whole affair not unduly distressful. Only in rare cases, like the short story Benediction from 1920, does Fitzgerald grant young women reproductive autonomy, and only then for shock value. When the character Lois drops the term birth control in a conversation with her brother, she does so with the conviction that everybody talks about everything now. Yet the short story hints that her worldliness is just talk. More commonly, traditional notions of shame color his treatment of female sexuality. In The Beautiful and Damned, Anthony Patch's mistress, Dorothy Dot Raycroft, convinces herself throughout high school that she's retained her technical purity only to be lured subsequently into separate consummated affairs with dishonorable men before meeting Anthony, who turns out to be disreputable himself. Although Fitzgerald grants Dot the self-awareness that men desired only to use her, he denies her the agency either to resist or to turn the tables by allowing her vixen-like to use the men for her own pleasure. Her susceptibility to sex is unfortunately a reductive sign of her working-class status. She's not a nice girl, a judgment that also applies to Jewel Hudson in the naturalistic short story Mayday from 1920. She blackmails the Yale alumnus Gordon Sterrett over their affair. Sex for Gloria Patch, meanwhile, hastens her decaying youth. In another shocking scene for 1922, she becomes pregnant soon into her marriage with Anthony and visits a friend, Constant Miriam, for an abortion. Tellingly, she recuperates from this unapologetic act of family planning by reading Tarkington's Penrod. In the long run, the effect proves far more baleful than Janet March's not unduly distrustful reaction to her abortion. Gloria may believe that avoiding motherhood preserves her youth, but the unromantic manner in which she chooses to end that pregnancy is for Fitzgerald a Nietzschean incident indicative of the squandering of resources that ages her prematurely. As for his heroes, those that dally with sexually available women predictably shirk adult responsibility. Mayday ends with Gordon Sterrett shooting himself in the head rather than end up irrevocably married to Jewel Hudson. Anthony Patch suffers a breakdown when Dot turns up on his doorstep after he reconciles with his wife, and his mistress's unwanted appearance regresses him to a state of childhood that leaves him poring over his childhood postage stamp book. In other cases, young men evince almost a prepubescent fear of sexuality. And there's a much mocked scene in This Side of Paradise in which Anthony Blaine flees the apartment of a pair of promiscuous chorus girls, convinced that he sees a vision of the devil sitting on their couch. Anthony's escape was all the odder given how insistently in the novel he depicts himself as what in the day would have been called a kissing bandit. Early on, he even gives his first girlfriend, Isabel Borhe, a hickey while petting. Dick Diver suffers from sexual immaturity. In Tender as the Night, the use of multiple perspectives allows readers to infer that at least one female character does grow into adulthood, but that he's incapable of it. Fueling Dick's infatuation with actress Rosemary Hoyt is his father complex, the quasi-incestuous attraction to young women susceptible to his authority and charm, which earlier drew the fragile patient Nicole Warren into becoming his wife. Initially, Dick declines to move beyond adulterous kisses with Rosemary, at once contemptuous of her ingenue image in movies such as Daddy's Girl, and adamant that he will not ruin her. After he learns that the teenage movie star was once caught in flagrante delicto on a train, however, the possibility that her guilelessness is performative, a product of her acting skills, that erodes his resistance. Although Fitzgerald never explicitly spells out his hero's infatuation, Dick seems most drawn to the combination of freshness and experience that will allow him to bathe in Rosemary's youth without being responsible for it. And significantly, the moment he commits to sleeping with her, he turns his back in a Parisian restaurant in a group of older women who are Gold Star mothers, that is, women who've lost their sons in the Great War, who embody, quote, the maturity of an older America. Alongside Rosemary's vivacity, maturity can only strike him as hoary and irrelevant. So if Dick's inability to reconcile youth and sexuality traps him in a kind of emotional stasis, Jay Gatsby's romanticism causes him to revert to an odd pre-adolescence. As Nick Carraway reveals, James Gath lost his virginity at a young age, even before his fortuitous meeting at 17 with Dan Cody, the millionaire who catalyzes his transformation into Gatsby. He knew women early, and since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins because they were ignorant, of others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. Only much later, on the eve of Gatsby's departure for war, does Daisy Fay unknowingly divest him of this sexual callousness. The mechanism of transformation is a kiss. Quote, he knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never again romp like the mind of God. So he waited for a moment, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star, and then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Notably, this is not Gatsby and Daisy's first kiss. Indeed, the incarnation occurs after the pair have had sex, for Nick reveals later that the aspiring dreamer initially, quote, took what he could get, ravenously, unscrupulously, eventually took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. His original intention was to take what he could and go, but upon this particular kiss in which he chooses Daisy to embody his ambitions, he found that he had committed himself to the following of Grail. To a certain extent, such sudden nobility follows the emerging formula of romance novels, such as Edith Maud Hull's The Sheik, in which the character we associate with Rudolph Valentino is brought to his knees by a true love that teaches him the idealized satisfaction of monogamy. And that occurs usually after the, to be blunt, after the main character rapes the main female character, the Sheik of Araby, into your tent I will creep. We should wonder just how devoted to Daisy Jay Gatsby has remained throughout their 5-year separation. Are we really to believe that he's been chaste from 1917 to 1922 in honor of that, quote, wedding, not an accidental word, between his unutterable visions and her soft, perishable breath? To doubt it impugns the very purity of Gatsby's investment in his dream. His behavior at his own parties suggests that he doesn't avail himself of the plentiful women intrigued by his mystique. As Nick notes when he attends his first West Egg party, no one swooned backward on Gatsby and no French Bob touched Gatsby's shoulder. As a consequence, although Gatsby might look like an elegant young roughneck, he's curiously asexual. Nowhere is his version of technical purity more apparent than when he and Daisy reunite in Nick's cottage. Rather than take Daisy into his arms as a Valentino would, he commits a series of comically awkward pratfalls that recalls no less than Tarkington's main character in 17. He gets drenched in a downpour, knocks a clock off a mantelpiece, and nearly falls down his own stairway. As if the slapstick were not evocative enough of the character type called the mooncalf in this period, Nick reprimands him for acting like a little boy. Jay Gatsby might be 31 or 32, chained to a definitive moment in his past when he was 26 or 27, eluding an identity he abandoned at 17, but at least in this case, he's very similar to a description that Booth Tarkington was criticized for, that he is writing about, quote, the one and the same boy growing backwards instead of forwards. So finally, rather than condemn climaxing scenes with kisses instead of coitus, as juvenile as Fiedler does, it seems to me more fair to say that Fitzgerald's age consciousness drove him to construct a firm divide between amorous acts. Petting represented the youthful idealism of romance, but sex initiated characters into adult complexities. Of course, few modernists could celebrate the lusty mutuality of adult intimacy without lapsing into shame, misogyny, or perversion. And I think Catty Compson is a perfect example of that. Fitzgerald's attraction to petting, however, continues to stereotype him far more negatively than Faulkner's fixation with rape and incest, or Joyce's with filth and paraphilia. In the end, the kiss was simply the vehicle that allowed Fitzgerald's characters to be both adult and young. All right, final paragraph. Few literary historians today would criticize a writer as immature for failing to depict, quote, consummated genital love. In Fitzgerald's best work, the complexity of style, characterization, and feeling all counter the judgmental popular among early reviewers that his sensibility was callow, as well as the dissenting opinion of later commentators like Fiedler that he lacked adult gravitas. That said, the ways in which popular culture continues to glamorize his rise and fall and the tragedy of his early demise at 44 reinforced the superficial presumption that he never had a chance to come of age. Nor does it help that the immutable association of him with jazz-age flappers and bacchanalian revelries perpetuates an image of him as forever boyish. Fitzgerald, it's important to note, lived almost a half-decade longer than Edgar Allan Poe and 14 years longer than Sylvia Plath, yet we don't think of them as quote-unquote young as we do him. Most of the cliches that barnacle appreciation of his accomplishments arise from the fact that he wrote so overtly and often sentimentally about youth. Yet his aversion to aging didn't form in a vacuum. Nearly every aspect of his age consciousness relates directly to the culture around him, from the in-betweenness of adolescence to the fixation with milestones, and even a story as sort of fantastical as The Curious Case of Benjamin Button can be seen to dramatize the desire to resist the aging process, to reverse the aging process even. Fitzgerald may have foregrounded the theme of lost youth more than his contemporaries, certainly more than Dos Passos or Faulkner, but he was far from an anomaly in dramatizing confusion about how to act one's age in a culture that insists that age is just a number. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a beautiful presentation as well. And now I will add back all of the professors to the stream so that we may proceed to the questions. So first and foremost, just checking if everyone, please speak something so that, I know the audio is all right and all that.
I hope you can hear me.
Professor Shaheen, can you hear us? Yeah, but we don't hear you. I think maybe can you check if you muted your microphone or something like that? Once more. Yeah. No, we can't hear you yet. No, I think it's something in your hardware, something about your microphone specifically. Oh, wow. And the first question was for you too, so I hope you.
Can you hear me now?
There you
Yes.
go.
Yes.
Oh,
There
good.
you go.
Whew. Okay, I was getting nervous. I'm sorry.
Okay, I will
Okay.
mute the other. I will mute. Don't touch anything. I will mute you, and then the other people in the call because we can hear an echo. I think you removed the headphones or something, right? Okay. So the question comes from Marcela, and she asks, I'm sorry, Marcela, I'll have to rearrange your question a little bit just to, I don't know, make it a little easier to speak. She talks about the ambulance driving in one man's initiation and how central that is to the novel, and she asked you to elaborate on that. And also, she draws a comparison to Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, in which this driving the ambulance is also central to Stephen's identity in post-war Paris. And if you see any parallels or connections between these two novels.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's been since grad school that I've read The Well of Loneliness. Isn't that one of the first kind of openly lesbian novels that we have from the 20s? So I don't know if I can speak much to The Well of Loneliness. It's been over 20 years since I've read it. But as far as the ambulance goes, one thing to remember, if you go back to 1917, 1918, when Dos Passos was there on the Western Front and on the Italian front, so these were very sophisticated machines. We look at them today and they look just so quaint and almost cute, But not only did you have the cranks in the front to crank the engine up, But then you had a bunch of gears that just were not intuitive to somebody that early on in the history of automobiles. And so several biographies talk about this, most recently The Ambulance Drivers by James McGrath Morris. And to be able to drive one of these, especially in such fraught conditions with, well, you get the one instance from the novel with, a German plane bearing down on you, but even just with all the muddy roads, think of the rainy seasons we had, Passchendaele and elsewhere. It took a lot of skill to be able to drive one of these, especially when you have wounded human beings in the back of it. And so what I'd like to focus on more, if I can kind of turn this into a publishable article, is just how intuitive you have to be to drive one of these things. And so you really have to sort of see this ambulance as a kind of extension of yourself in many ways that we just kind of take for granted because, well, cars have gotten so much better and they can do so much more for us. But this was something that even Gertrude Stein talks about. If you remember, she drove her little Ford, I think it was, through the streets of Paris doing various kinds of war work. And this is talked about in the autobiography, Alice B. Toklas. But just how temperamental these instruments were. And so you really had to sort of cater to these instruments to be able to act properly.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think that was a great answer. And Gabriela brings you another question about Manhattan Transfer, but it's a question that I had intended in asking the other professors about the other authors. And she mentions that in Manhattan Transfer, it is mentioned that Jimmy and Ellen were in Europe during the war, but besides that, the conflict appears to be just a distant memory. And she asks you if there are any elements in the structure of the book that are somehow connected to the war, or if it is intentionally kept completely out of Manhattan. And I extend the same question because, of course, all the novels we talked about in this presentation were, written after the war. And, there are characters involved in the war, certainly. J. Gatsby is the most notable of them. I don't recall any specific Faulkner character, but I'm certain Professor Hagood will remember any veterans, and of course, Faulkner himself and his relationship with the war. And I would like to ask each of you how the war appears or doesn't appear in the text, like in the content of the text, and if the war is somehow crystallized into the structure of these authors' novels.
Would you like me to start out? Okay. Yeah, I think here's where Dos Passos is really taking his cue from the futurists and the vorticists by, if the belief in both of these movements is that warfare is everywhere and that violence is both inevitable and to be embraced, then Dos Passos, I think, consciously keeps us out of the battlefields, even though Ellen and Jimmy go there. And it's actually probably the best time in their marriage when they are there, to kind of keep that focus on warfare on the home front or during civilian, not civilian, but during peacetime. But you see all these elements of violence and hostility there. And I'll just give you one quick example. It seems no coincidence that the very summer that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand takes place, 1914 June, and then through the July crisis. What's happening, this is when Jimmy actually meets Ellen. And when they meet, I talk about it in my presentation, and they're dancing for the first time. George Baldwin is also there. George ultimately ends up marrying her, even though that marriage isn't going to be any more successful than her others. But as they're reading newspapers and as they're talking about what's happening over in Europe with the assassination in Sarajevo, what George says is he's trying to get Ellen to pay attention to him, and she's already, interested in Stan. Jimmy is kind of coming into the story, and he says at one point, "I would like to take a gun and I would like to shoot you." And it seems very reminiscent. All of a sudden, he's playing the role of Gavrilo Princip, the Serbian nationalist, and here's Ellen, who's now kind of in the role of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So you've got these peacetime developments that are running parallel to what's going on over in Europe. And I think for Dos Passos to try to move too much of that story over to Europe, even though Jimmy does go there as a war correspondent and Ellen goes with him, it takes the focus away from the kind of warfare that's going on back in the metropolis, which seems so parallel to what they experience in Europe.
Great, thank you. Professor Hagood, you seem to have the intention of answering right now, so be my guest. Go ahead.
I'm glad to do so. As far as characters who, were involved or fought in the Great War, there are quite a few for Faulkner. There's early stories that deal with these topics. And of course, Soldier's Pay is very much about Donald Mann coming home from the war. And it's really, the novel is quite a bit about trauma and wounding and vision and how all these things play out. But aside from that, also Sartorus, as it was published, the title is published under, or Flags in the Dust, again, is how the novel is generally published these days. That novel, again, it's such a turning point, but it's about, deals with a character named, they call him Young Bayard Sartorus, and he is someone whose family has had a lot of experience, was involved in the Civil War very famously and so forth. And he comes back home, and it's dealing with how this particular figure who has lost his twin brother also in the war and has very traumatic memories of that, and how he tries to get back in society. But even while that's happening, there's an African-American character who comes back to the South, to this space in Mississippi, and who has seen a different way to live. Caspi, he's seen this different way to to live and to be able to be in Paris and to be in France, to be in Europe, and be seen as taken more seriously, and maybe even seen as more human in certain ways. And yet where he is experiencing this situation where back at home those ideas don't fly, even with his own father, who says, "Hey, you can't, this way you're trying to be won't work here in Mississippi." And of course we can think about the very famous parade in Harlem, and the Harlem Hellcats coming back, from their very distinguished service in the Great War. And then this moment, when jazz is so big and so forth, and yet, Duke Ellington he can only play music in the Cotton Club. He's not able to sit down and eat and drink with people. As with white people, it's just not permitted. So Faulkner comes to grips with that, not as it plays out in New York, but as it plays out in a small town in the South, and how, what kind of conflicts arise from that. So that's very much on his mind. And then just one other thing I'll mention: As I Lay Dying, the character Darrell Bundren seems to be a veteran, and he maybe suffers from what would have been called at the time shell shock, maybe. And so that, is a novel, again, really pretty much finished in 1929, but Faulkner doesn't finish the typescript until January of 1930. And then of course later on Faulkner will write a fable much later. But really World War I figures quite a lot, World War I figures quite a lot in his writing, and it is a factor in the 20s, and certainly a different kind of paper. There's a lot of work going on right now about Faulkner and the Great War. And I think about David Davidson, particularly right now, is doing a lot of work along those lines. So it's, there's quite a bit there. A very different paper would have foregrounded that.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Curnutt, do you have anything you want to say about Fitzgerald and the war? Oh, sorry, you were muted. That's
Okay.
on. There you
Thank
go.
you. Well, his wartime experience for me is very important because I am sitting about maybe 10 miles from Camp Sheridan, where Camp Sheridan used to be, where he was stationed. And actually only about a mile away from where I am is the ground where the airfield would have been, where pilots trained. And of course the piloting is very important in Faulkner. But in Montgomery, that field is kind of known for when these young trainees would come to Montgomery. Supposedly, they all flew to the other side of town and buzzed Zelda's house. And there's a short story called The Last of the Bells that's set in his fictional version of Montgomery, in which one of them may or may not commit suicide because the Zelda character has rejected him. So there's a weird conflation of romance and the war in Fitzgerald that I think is kind of hard to pull apart. I think that if Fitzgerald had actually made it to the front, he probably would have depicted it a lot less romantically, more along the lines of Dos Passos or Hemingway. But there is a great short story that I think people don't pay enough attention to. It's kind of a later one from 1936 called I Didn't Get Over, in which he talks about, again, it's a training story that's set just north of Montgomery, about an accident on a barge where they were learning to take horses and men across the river. And I think Fitzgerald felt tremendous guilt that he never made it over. And that title of that story is kind of a rebuke to himself. And the war certainly is very central to The Great Gatsby. It's kind of the bond between Jay and Nick. In fact, Michael Ferris Smith just published a prequel to Gatsby called Nick, that probably half the book is about Nick's wartime experience. And it's interesting to speculate about that because it's also suppressed in the novel. But, I think, unfortunately for Fitzgerald, probably his vision of war is still a little too tied up with the romanticism that the guys that did make it over really lost almost immediately, seeing what the truth of war was. But you also see in Tender Is the Night where the characters understand the consequences of war, where Dick Diver and his friends go and visit the battlefield, and he has this wonderful line about my beautiful world was blown up here at a cost of 1,000 lives afoot. So, and I think Fitzgerald was a better theorist of war, had a better sense of it. It's just he could never unmingle it from romance.
Thank you so much. And I actually want to keep you around, Professor Curnutt, for another question of my own.
Sure.
You were mentioning this relationship with that youth and the loss of youth has to pleasure and to all of that, and it reminded me of that famous sequence in The Great Gatsby where Gatsby says, "Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can." And one thing I checked right now, and I even got my personal copy of the book to check it, is that happens precisely in the chapter where Nick's narration reveals, let's say, Gatsby's fake identity. And so, like, he says that he can repeat the past precisely in the moment that we learn how closeted is not the right word, how veiled his portrayal of his own background is. And I would like to know how that desire to return to the past works, and this to me suggests a larger subtlety in the matter than perhaps his critics of, Fitzgerald the youthful one and all that would suggest.
I do think that he gets stereotyped way too much for being obsessed with youth. And, again, Hemingway had a line about when Tender as a Night came out about how he was kind of doing a whiny little devil's dance over lost youth. And I think it's, I think a lot of that generation, I mean, they were called the Lost Generation, not just because of the casualties of war, but because all of those kinds of guideposts that were supposed to mark their initiation into adulthood, were either prevented them from becoming adults. They came home to a world where there were no jobs, or in the case of one man's initiation, kind of catapulted them into an adulthood that maybe they weren't emotionally prepared for. I guess the term I would use, and I would do it as a way of sort of emphasizing the gender element here, is the term in the 20s for young women who were sexually active up to, I guess, the absolute point of no return was technical purity. And I think when I read that scene of Gatsby about can't repeat the past, he's in a sense going back and reclaiming his technical purity. He just, it's his, and he never realizes that he can't repeat the past. He sort of dies assuming that Daisy is going to, or at least claiming to Nick that Daisy will call him. And Nick kind of speculates that deep down he had to know that wasn't going to happen. So I like that term, technical purity, technical innocence. It's kind of like what people have to cling to after they've squandered their youth. And of course, all these things are really metaphorical. The Lost Generation was probably no more sexually active than their Victorian grandparents, but they were just more public about it.
Thank you, Professor. And we have yet another question for you. This one from Roberta Fabri Viscardi, who spoke yesterday in our Portuguese-speaking panel.
Hello, Roberta.
And she asks, when thinking about Dick Diver specifically, it seems that he has reached two low turning points in life, and the first one being his wedding to Nicole. And she says hi also, and she asks, how do you see this this question of Dick Diver's two turning points?
Well, I think Tender as a Night is an interesting book to teach because I did it once for a book club that asked me to do Tender as a Night, and I had no sooner sat down than one guy said, "These are the most obnoxiously narcissistic people I've ever met in my life," and I just kind of thought, well, my job is over here. I think it's difficult for us in this day and age to really understand what Dick is going through, in part because he seems to vilify Nicole as robbing him of his vitality, but I think also because that notion that he was supposed to be a great man, and that the new world kind of destroyed all of those guideposts by which he would have realized his potential. I think that just rubs wrong against people in this day and age. I don't think we believe in those things in maybe the way that Fitzgerald wanted to. So, I think it's a difficult novel to really come to grips with from a contemporary perspective. But I do think we can read Dick's attraction to Nicole, and I do think it's a little more complex than maybe the way it gets talked about, because he does resist her attraction to him and his attraction to her, and it becomes part of his dying fall, and it becomes his pursuit of that youth and his desire to maintain that Gatsby-like belief in the past. But he looks ridiculous by the end of it. I mean, he's trying to water ski to to show off for her, and just ends up like many of us middle-aged men preening for younger women, looking absolutely foolish. In many ways, Rosemary ends up being the most mature person in that book, because she kind of moves out of adolescence into a sexually acclimated adult world, and after she and Dick consummate their affair, she kind of feels sorry for him that he never grew up.
Thank you so much, Professor. I have a question for Professor Hagood. And after that, I will open the floor so that you may ask questions to one another. I think that might be interesting. But Professor Hagood, you talked about Faulkner's like problematic relationship with modernism, and how he perhaps saw his sort of modernizing style as a kind of decay, as a kind of like a loss from his previous more Belle Epoque aesthetics. And my question is, wouldn't this perception of modernity as decay precisely be the modernist vision, you know, at its apex, especially English-speaking modernism? If we think about Eliot and Pound, and how they saw, you know, this, we might say with Benjamin, the idea of, you know, the catastrophe of history. How do you see that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's you know, that is sort of the irony of it, and I think, you know, this is this kind of dynamic. I mean, this would be, I guess you could say, a kind of high modernism. This kind of critique, it's a type of modernism. I think where maybe for me, Faulkner, I think for me, where I'm coming from and trying to think through these things is probably that I think that Faulkner's, I think one can discern in Faulkner a kind of, if you follow, you know, when you follow his career, a kind of his being a little bit all over the place. I mean, I think about his novel Pylon. People don't read Pylon maybe as much, but you know, this is a novel that's really trying to think through media and you know, trying to think through form in a way that actually is very close. It takes certain chapter titles from T.S. Eliot's writing, and it's something that looks more self-consciously modern in the sense of speed. It's about these barnstormers. It's set in New Orleans, so it's not rural. It's urban, and so it's a different kind of a thing. And certainly insofar as, again, the kind of Alan Tate formulation of, you know, this Renaissance moment or rebirth moment being one in which the Southern thinkers, in a sense, this is one version of it, step into the modernist moment with this backward glance. This is very much a part of this agrarian thing. I mean, what's interesting, if one sort of contextualizes Faulkner in terms of agrarian writing, it's a type of anti-modernism that is a type of modernism. So, I mean, there's a sense in which there's a kind of the issue is a little bit foreclosed, you know. I had the privilege of talking about some of these kind of anti-modernism things a few years back in a kind of a symposium on that, and that was something that was this kind of circular kind of a thing that came about. But absolutely, I guess the short answer is yes, absolutely. This is this movement. It was a kind of an inevitable thing, and I don't want to. There's obviously another part of Faulkner that I think, you know, obviously embraced modernist technique with great gusto, and was a great fan of Sherwood Anderson and many others. And people maybe don't always remember as much Evelyn Scott's The Wave, and the fact that she had wrote a kind of promotional piece to go with The Sound and the Fury. And these were all modernist works, and there's a lot of interesting kind of interconnection in certain ways between Faulkner's writing in this period and, say, the writing of Juno Barnes or something like that. So, you know, that very much is the case. That is absolutely a kind of modernism. of course, the line between what people were doing, what artists were doing in Paris and elsewhere in the 1910s and early 1900s, that line between that and modernism, you could just say that's a kind of a one fed into the other, or that one is a version of the other. So I think that's there. I think that's, yeah, I mean, that's very much the case. But I think there is this other thing in Faulkner, and maybe I want to be careful about making some kind of argument about white Southern exceptionalism, especially. But I think that I do think there is a dynamic there that maybe is not a kind of, that the thing that's called romanticism is has certain specific resonances with Faulkner that maybe are not there as much with Hemingway or Dos Passos or Fitzgerald. I'm maybe going out on a limb a little bit with that, but I think they come to a certain place earlier than Faulkner does. And I think that's, for me, kind of what makes them a little different in that respect. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Professor. That was a great answer. And this this subject you mentioned about the tension between representation of local agrarian society and this impulse of modernity, either in the form or in the content of these novels. This is something that is for our audience, this is, to me, echoes a lot of what happened in Brazilian modernism. And there is this big thing in literary history here in Brazil about the tension between having this idea of the local color and versus the universality of a subject. And that segues into a question Professor Jorge de Almeida asked to Professor Curnutt and Professor Shaheen, that about whether or not Fitzgerald and Dos Passos would agree with Faulkner's argument that the best literature is about the old universal truths, such as love, pride, compassion, and sacrifice. That sound something that Dos Passos or Fitzgerald might agree with.
Can I say something before anybody jumps in? I just got to say, I'm not sure Faulkner himself would have agreed with that in the 1920s. I don't know. I mean, that's a formulation that quote, of course, comes from the Nobel Prize speech, and Faulkner kind of repackaged it in different ways, and that around that time after World War II. But I'm not sure if Faulkner himself, the 1920s version of Faulkner, I don't know if he would have been quite so sold on that. But I just want to throw that in before everybody else goes.
That is great. So among the two of you, who will speak first, Professor Shaheen or Professor Curnutt? Okay, Aaron, just one moment. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a crack at that question. It's a really good one, because Dos Passos is really tough in that regard, especially because of the way he embraces technology in the very rendering of his stories. He's probably the most famous of these three authors for using cinematic technologies of the time to tell a story. And Dos Passos also is known for, sometimes criticized for, writing flat characters, but it's actually a part of a larger kind of stylistic plan in rendering them this way, to sort of speak to, oftentimes with lament, the way in which the speed of modern life has kind of gutted people of their of their humanity. And so I think as you sort of look at that sense of lament in how these characters are gutted, it does sort of speak to these old truths that Faulkner talks about in his 1950 Nobel speech. He's an interesting character also because, he never, that I know of, really went in for religion, and yet he had a deep reverence for people who did. And there are some really tender moments in some of these novels when people go into churches and look at the beautiful things. I can think of one from Three Soldiers when John Andrews is recuperating from his leg injury, and he's looking up at these beautiful frescoes. Same thing happens in One Man's Initiation with Martin Howe when a beautiful abbey is being used to store munitions in its cellar, and it's eventually destroyed by the Germans. There's a sense of lament to that, and so back to these old truths. I think if you look to the later Dos Passos, where he more aligns with the political right, those things start to come out, especially in his kind of homage to Jefferson and some of the founding fathers. It's harder to find, I would say, in his earlier writings and of the 1920s. That said, he and Hemingway loved to get together in Paris and read long passages from the King James Bible. Not just for the sound, but for the content.
Thank you, Professor. Now, Professor Curnutt, if you will.
Well, I often have wondered what Fitzgerald would have been like if he had lived into his 50s and kind of hit that era of modernism like Faulkner and Dos Passos, where I think it's very indicative of that generation when they got into their 50s to think in terms of universals. You see that in Hemingway with The Old Man and the Sea, and Dwight is it Dwight McDonald? My brain's kind of fried right now, but he kind of goes after that whole generation in their later years as being kind of faux biblical and writing parables, and you see that with Steinbeck as well. They kind of enter their their Pearl Buck period, if you want to think of it that way. I think he would have done that because I'm not sure he ever lost his romanticism in that sense. I think certainly he wanted to believe in those older truths. And, I think that if you look at The Last Tycoon, he's really celebrating that idea of, Monroe Starr is kind of like the anti-Dick Diver. He's the guy that never loses those foundational values and is able to kind of bring together a whole industry in order to realize that great melding of artistic and genius and capitalism, at least in the parts he was able to finish. So I think he would have agreed with it. Of course, his remaining comments on Faulkner and as the 30s go on were fairly negative, and I think that was a lot of his own just jealousy out of his own career frustrations. But yeah, I definitely think he would have gone for those universal truths.
Thank you, Professor. And now, since we are nearing 3 hours of event, I would like to open the floor for you to ask questions for one another, so that after that we may, iron out everything and finish our event quite spectacularly, I might
add. Professor Hagood, I'd love to ask you this question. I love that you used eroding into a modernist, the Faulkner. Let me ask you how you read the character of Horace Benbow in Sartorus. Because he's the one, he strikes me as the most kind of that Belle Epoque kind of, an aesthete. And yet to my reading, he's such a buffoon. And even by the end of the novel, he really kind of turns that corner into nihilism, the way that, I'm trying to remember the married woman he's having an affair with off the top of my head right now. Yeah, but in terms of eroding into modernism, from his late romanticism of the 1920s, how do you read a character like Horace Benbow?
Well, what's kind of interesting about him is he's not only is he in that novel, but he's going to show up again in Sanctuary,
Yeah.
And so, by the time he's there, he's a kind of a, he's there to, he's part, he's involved in this situation, and I think, I think as far as how I read him, I don't. I mean, absolutely, I understand the reading, and certainly it's there, and it's very valid that that he's a kind of buffoon in a way. But I don't know that. I don't know that in the constellation of Faulkner's sort of world that character. I think there's a part of Faulkner that wants to, even as he takes a realistic approach and he exposes the, I guess, shaky foundations of a character like that. There's a part of him that never could quite let go of that kind of character.
Yeah.
I guess for me, I guess from my viewpoint, Horace, I read Horace probably not just within himself, but in relation to these other characters who are going to show up. So Gavin Stevens and, all these characters who kind of continue to be these sort of Galahad type. I mean, Quentin referred to as a half-baked Galahad. Quentin is also very ridiculous, and yet at the same time, I mean, there's a sense in which Quentin couldn't be more ridiculous, and yet at the same time, I think the reader is supposed to feel a very heavy tragedy about this character who, kills himself in the moment when he has these realizations about race and performativity. So it's I think this is the thing I think I'm today at least I want to read Faulkner as not wanting to let go of his sort of romanticism. Exactly. I'm thinking a lot about it. I was really struck. I won't have much more to say, but just I was really struck by some of the things both of y'all were talking about this idea. Okay, Dos Passos older, or if Fitzgerald had lived, kind of where they would be, because as Faulkner got older, and really to Kirk's point, Professor Curnutt's point, Faulkner, when he has this long affair with Meta Carpenter in Hollywood, and when she writes about it, she writes about him, having the water running in the bathroom to hide any, untoward sounds during their relationship, and he's somebody who, he would have these kind of Arthurian parties, and of course, when he was going to move to Virginia, he was part of the Virginia Hunt Club, and
Right.
there's this thing in him that I think he didn't really. There's a lot of this talk about him trying to maintain this sort of a romantic thing. So obviously, he's a very sophisticated artist, very sophisticated thinker, and I think he was able to see early on, and really, I think certainly by the time he was in Canada, he already sees, But I think maybe see that ability. When I say seeing this other side of this, but in a way, I think it could be argued, or at least today, I want to argue that this made him kind of miss the more romantic vision more. And I think Horace been both part of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I'd love to ask both Professor Shaheen and Hagood if at one point years ago I had envisioned writing a novel all about modernism and aging, and then I guess I outgrew it or got old or something. Part of my frustration was I couldn't find it as overtly in either Dos Passos and Faulkner, even though, Faulkner has a story called Adolescence at one point. So I'm just kind of curious with the two of you, how would you describe for each of them that theme of modernist lost youth? Do you see it having any parallels with Fitzgerald? And I'm thinking, Aaron, I'm thinking of a particular cartoon that was in the newspapers in 1922 that Fitzgerald reprinted, where it shows Fitzgerald and Dos Passos as enfant terrible, the terrible children, and it kind of has Dos Passos with a little sailboat, almost like the kids in Sanctuary there at the end in the garden. I was just curious. I just don't necessarily see that theme as intensely as I do in Fitzgerald.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, his first novel is one man's initiation, but initiated into what exactly? If the war, and this actually goes to my question for you, Kirk, if we have time, is what role the war actually played in terms of growing up. But the war is supposedly this, taking from the title, One Man's Initiation, the war is supposedly this rite of passage for these young men. What emerges on the other side of that war doesn't really seem to be necessarily adulthood or maturity. But sometimes it seems to be kind of life and death, almost these zombie-like figures,
Yeah.
who've been initiated into as a kind of mechanistic living, a biological living. But something has kind of been gutted from the soul. And that's what seems to characterize the maturity for so many of these Dos Passos characters. I'm thinking here maybe of Uncle James from Manhattan Transfer, who by midlife is already washed up.
Mm-hmm.
And, Ellen is very worried about getting old, and, the point when that facial cream won't hide the wrinkles anymore. I think it was the critic Cecilia Ticci who one time said that Dos Passos' characters don't so much die or age as much as they break down like machines.
Yeah.
And that seems to be where maturity takes them.
That's great. That's a great answer.
I think for Faulkner, I agree. I think the trajectory of his, art in general, his way of thinking about characters, I don't know, it's just very different from Fitzgerald. I think he comes from a different place. I agree very much. I don't think it's near as overt. I mean, interestingly, when Janoris Jones and the rector, the father of Donald Mann, are speaking in Soldier's Pay, they're kind of talking about being old versus being young and so forth. But I think that specific thing of, lost youth, particularly youth that is connected with the modernist era,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a lot harder to find in Faulkner. I do. You get to the Reivers, Faulkner's final novel, and it starts out, Grandfather Said, and it's obviously looking back, but it's not looking, it's looking back at really a moment arguably before modernism. It's much more turn of the century. Again, I hate to be too careful with those, like modernism starts on this date, obviously it doesn't, but I think the vision that in that novel it's not like Fitzgerald's at all. It's about lost youth in a way, but it's not the same kind of thing. It's this adolescent, as I know you know. So I don't know that it's, I'm just thinking about it, and I haven't really thought about it before, but I guess there's nothing that just leaps into my mind as being that same dynamic that you get with, with Fitzgerald. I mean, I may be there more with Hemingway or somebody, but not so much. Yeah.
I was just thinking of this, of The Sun Also Rises, when you were talking about the sort of coming out of the war with that indeterminacy of being adults. And it always strikes me in that novel, and it strikes me with Dick Diver and Anthony Patch sometimes as well. Those guys are 35 or 36, when those, even Gatsby, I think, is born in 1890. So they're, that's fairly late in the day back in that period. I mean, but also, I think with Faulkner, he did write a lot of initiation stories, barn burning, the bear, those kinds of very Joycean kind of, once you cross that line, it's done. And I think that's his more conception of it is, it was not the lament for lost youth. It was just kind of the epiphany that it was gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Absolutely. Say it's not something I've thought about a whole lot, but yeah. I appreciate being able to think about it now. Thank you.
It's a tough question to write about, because writing about youth, it kind of perpetuates the idea that we should be youth obsessed. And, maybe what we need is somebody to write about, the pleasures of aging in modernism, if there are any.
I gotta just put in a plug for Willa Cather. She's right there with Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Dos Passos, and Faulkner is in that. For me personally, I just love her, and she's the one who seems to handle these issues of middle age.
Yeah.
In all of her novels, it seems like ones that seem to be about youth. Very often, they're coming from some perspective of somebody who's middle age. And
yeah, like I sort of hinted at, it always strikes me that Fitzgerald loved Paul's case so much, and yet Paul's case is so implicitly critical of Paul's sort of, dandyism and his ultimate decision to, the waste, which it is, the waste of him committing suicide there at the end.
Yeah. I never really thought much about Fitzgerald and Cather together, but since your presentation, Kirk, I'm going to be thinking about that a lot more.
Yeah. Well, he certainly loved her, and he loved Edith Wharton as well. And he appreciated everything that Dos Passos did, even if their friendship kind of faded as the years went on. It's unfortunate that he never really appreciated Faulkner, although he did early on kind of mention him in the emerging early 30s. And I've always been intrigued that Faulkner wanted to adapt The Curious Case of Benjamin Button for Hollywood. I mean, imagine if he had ever been able to do that. I think that would have been an interesting experience.
Indeed. If one thing I would like to add, looking from the outside in at this discussion about youth, is that perhaps the differences between the three authors has a lot to do with how the three of them relate to time itself. Faulkner is famous for being very past obsessed. You can't repeat the past. The other way around. What's the quote? Oh man.
Past is never past.
Yes. Past is never dead. It's not even past. Thank you so much. And how that is, quite strikingly different from the other two, right? And I feel that's one way to look at the problem.
I know Faulkner had read Bergson, Henry Bergson. Seemed like most modernists had read Henry Bergson. His idea of durée and trying to sort of live simultaneously in the past and the present. But I don't know. Do you know, Kirk, if Fitzgerald had read much Henry Bergson?
That's a great question. I know that we have I think he was probably familiar with those ideas, especially we have a essay in our book on Beautiful and Damned, in which one of the critics talks about Fitzgerald sort of absorbing some of those ideas but not directly reading him. I don't think there's any documentation of that, but it tends to be again kind of his romanticism that would make him compatible with that.
Yeah, sure. I'm sort of stuck in a similar place. I can't find any direct links between Bergson and Dos Passos, but surely he was so well known at the time, sort of like Freud.
Yeah.
It would be hard not to know about about Bergson if you're just living in those currents and reading those journals. And but as far as your question about time, Pedro, Dos Passos seems to be one of these modernists who finds the element of durée as dangerous, where so many other modernists kind of, see it as a more affirmative experience, the ability to live in the past and the present simultaneously, with a sense of wholeness. Dos Passos, those are the characters who get clobbered, it seems. It seems like trying to live simultaneously in the past and the present. McNeil is a great example when he's thinking about the past, and he goes on his horse-drawn cart right over some railroad tracks, and his cart gets clobbered by a train, and sort of in these memories, in this moment of durée. So if Dos Passos had read Bergson, his ideas about time, he seemed to come up with a kind of different attitude about it than, say, Faulkner, who's, I think, found in Bergson more of this reaffirmation of being able to live a whole, even if just in small snapshots, kind of a whole existence by putting past and present together.
Thank you. And so, I'm hearing my own voice, which is, I mean, I like my own voice, but not that much. I will unmute each of you at a time. So we have come to, the dreaded 3-hour mark. And I don't want to be, too, the conversation is very nice, but I think we need to stop at some point. And of course, if you didn't have each other's email addresses by now, you certainly have, and we can, develop these conversations for time immemorial if we wish. So thank you so much to each and every one of you for participating. Thank you for the Laboratory of Studies on the Novel. We don't have an actual English translated name. That is something we might try and do in the future. But thank you for the laboratory, for Professors Jorge de Almeida and Sandra Vasconcelos for making this all possible, creating this space where we can, talk about these authors and discuss about the novel as a form in so many different and fulfilling ways. And thank you as well for the audience, for being with us for this whole time and asking such intelligent, interesting questions. And thank you to the University of São Paulo, finally, for, not finally, because, thank you to the University of São Paulo for providing us the institutional support for this. And finally, before I forget, thank you to Rafaela Gobo, who was, let's say, the technical director in yesterday's presentations. She really saved my life when I was, putting this all together, and I was going absolutely mad having to handle all those things. And she was like an angel come from the sky to, clear the debris a little bit. And so I will pass the floor to each of you in turn, starting from Professor Curnutt, then Professor Hagood, then Professor Shaheen, sort of reversing the order of the presentations, if that sounds all right. Thank you so much.
I will just say thank you again, and this has been a wonderful experience, and I think these kinds of conversations are fantastic. I would love to be in the audience for a similar one on the history of Brazilian literature at some point. So if you'll keep me on the mailing list, I'd love to tune in and learn.
Thank you, Professor. If I might plug a little bit, Professor Sandra has organized and edited a book about, the Brazilian novel in English. And so if you want to look it up, or anyone else, that might be interesting. Professor Hagood? Oh, sorry.
We're good. I really can't say it any more eloquently. I just echo those sentiments, and I'm just incredibly honored to be a part of this experience. And yeah, thank you very much.
Professor Shaheen?
Thanks again to University of Sao Paulo. Pedro, you've done a wonderful job coordinating this. Professor Vasconcelos, thank you to her as well for her time and energy. Kirk and Taylor, I'm going to be ripping off your presentations for my classroom use now for quite some time. So if your ears are buzzing at one point, you'll know why, because I'm ripping off your ideas and carrying them off as my own. They were terrific presentations. I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
I agree. Thank you to both of you.
All right. So with this, I think we may end the presentation and end the event finally in Portuguese now. Muito obrigado a todos que nos assistiram, tanto ontem quanto hoje. Foi cansativo, mas foi muito prazeroso. Obrigado às doutoras que vieram ontem para falar. Muito obrigado ao professor Jorge por ter moderado ontem. Muito obrigado ao professor Marcos pela apresentação de ontem. E também espero que a gente consiga fazer coisas parecidas mais vezes. Esse foi o primeiro evento que eu organizei. Informação que eu não vou deixar os nossos amigos americanos saberem. Mas foi muito prazeroso e fico muito feliz de ver isso aqui se tornar realidade. Sobre os certificados, eu enviei algumas vezes no chat as informações com o link. Eventualmente eu descobri qual era o problema, que eu não conseguia mandar o link antes, resolvi, então tá tudo aí, o formulário que você precisa, tudo mais. Caso tenham dúvidas, podem escrever para lero@usp.br e a gente vai esclarecer da melhor maneira possível. And that is all. Once and for all, this is finished. And if it happens again, it will not be the same. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great end of afternoon. Well, for us, you still have some afternoon left over there in America. Thank you so much. And goodbye.
Goodbye.